Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. Power 4 football season concludes today with the big, bad, mighty SEC. I am your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleagues and co-hosts, Payne Insider and Brad Powers. And Brad, I saw some of the rants on social media. It's a good thing that we're not going to be breaking down EA Sports 25 college football ratings today. I want you to keep your blood pressure a little bit lower than some of the clips I saw circulating.
Yeah, just not a gamer, and certainly not at my advanced stage. So, yeah, not a fan. Certainly not a fan when you're trying to find information on the upcoming season, which is fast approaching. And I got to go through 15 articles of EA Sports and 14 articles of 2025 recruiting.
It definitely makes things a little bit more challenging when you try and dive into some of these summer updates about these various programs. But Payne, SEC time, you have lasted long enough through 3-hour ordeals through the first 3 power conferences. Do you have proper hydration within arm's reach to try and get us through this endeavor?
Yeah, we got 3 of the big Fijis. So I believe, just looking at this now, they're 1.5 liters each. So we should make it, but this is not going 3 hours. I refuse. So once this starts getting closer to like 2 hours and 40 minutes, we're just going to start shutting this thing down.
All right, when we start to get through some of the teams at the top, I'll tell you you're on the clock for a 2-minute warning so we can properly partition this thing out. Ration our economy of words accordingly as we'll run the gamut from Alabama all the way down to the Texas twosome when we wrap things up around here. But we may as well start, guys, with the...
This is a much better start than the Big Ten, where we introduced the podcast with Iowa. So this is a step up in class.
That is a very, very good point. We can start towards the top of the heap with the Alabama Crimson Tide. That'll look a little bit different on the sidelines for the 2024 campaign. Nick Saban retires. Kalen DeBoer comes in from Washington. And when we look at Alabama, their win total, 9.5, shaded to the under. We've seen a little bit of movement in their odds to win the conference. 10-1, dipping down into the single digits. When we look at Alabama, Nick Saban being replaced after 17 seasons, which included 6 national titles. Alabama's won 10-plus games in 16 straight seasons. It's the longest streak in college football, but there are a ton of holes that this group is going to have to fill. When we look at Alabama, we'll get glimpses of this new-look offense early on with a couple of talented G5 teams, a trip to Madison for the non-conference schedule, but we won't get a real indication of maybe where Alabama is until they draw Georgia at home week 5, setting the table for realistic expectations with a new bench boss, so to speak. And Brad, offensively, Jalen Milroe will be the most familiar name. We saw glimpses of what he can do, much to our chagrin in the Iron Bowl against Auburn, as I know all 3 of us had a little Auburn over, Alabama under, but Milroe did flash 4 stretches. We look at where they are from a skill position standpoint. We have an indication of who the leading back can be in terms of Justice Haynes, but the receiving room will look a little bit different behind a veteran offensive line. When we look at Kalen DeBoer and who he brings in to run the offense in Nick Sheridan, this group will look similar to what we saw at Washington, a little bit different, or do we just give him the benefit of the doubt, given DeBoer has won everywhere he's gone with offensive talent?
I think it's a little bit of the latter. Because it just hasn't been one stop for DeBoer. Obviously we've seen several, whether it be Eastern Michigan, Indiana, Fresno State, and obviously Washington, all within a decade and all immediate success. So I'm actually upgrading this Alabama offense. Now, I will caveat, much the reason why it's upgraded is because last year's Alabama offense was the worst in 15 years for the Crimson Tide. When you take into consideration their talent level, top 5 in the country, and you're only number 35 in the country in yards per play, you're 58th in the country in total offense, and you don't even crack the top 20 in scoring offense. So let's not kid ourselves. This was not a good Alabama offense last year. And just from a pure power ratings, team power ratings aspect, I mean, that was Alabama's worst team since Nick Saban's first team back in 2007. I mean, the 2016, 18, and 2020 Alabama teams would have been a double-digit favorite over last year's team. So it's not like they are starting at peak Alabama during Saban's tenure. They're actually, in my opinion, DeBoer's catching at least the offense at a good time where there can be some improvement. You mentioned Nick Sheridan. I'm a little concerned. I'm going to be honest with you, at least compared to who was supposed to be the offensive coordinator for Alabama, being Ryan Grubb, who, after a couple weeks left to take the Seahawks job. Now Nick Sheridan has some familiarity with DeBoer. He was a tight end coach at Washington the last couple years, but if he was so great, why wasn't he the original choice? He was the OC at Indiana in 20 and 21. Didn't necessarily follow DeBoer to Fresno State at that point. So I'm a little concerned in that regard. They also lost the offensive line coach to the Seahawks, who was supposed to be the Alabama offensive line coach. But I thought they did a nice job there getting the Michigan State guy. Alabama's going to run some tempo, so it is going to look a little different. Obviously, you're going to see more, wide receiver sets, a little bit more focus on the passing game. Is Jalen Milroe, how does he fit Kalen DeBoer offense? I think it'll be fine. Obviously, you'd like to see more consistency on a down in and down out basis, but what does Jalen Milroe do best? That's throw the deep ball. Well, if you watched Michael Penix last year, I'm not expecting that from Milroe this year, but he is capable of making a couple of those types of throws each game. We even saw it in last year's Alabama offense. They lose their top two rushers, but you mentioned it. They're going to be fine at running back. Jam Miller, Justice Haynes, two really good backs there. I didn't even downgrade the running back position at all. To me, the biggest concern on offense actually is the wide receiver position. This is a far cry from what Alabama had at wide receiver from 2018, 19, 20, 21. Bond and Burton last year were fine, good receivers, not great, but they're no longer there. I thought it was pretty telling that the guy who flashed the most in the spring game was Bernard, the Washington's transfer, who wasn't even a top 3 receiver at Washington last year. So there's certainly some question marks. The expectation is this 5-star Ryan Williams kid, who should be a senior in high school, he skipped a year. He's going to come in and play right away at wide receiver. So I'm a little concerned from a depth aspect and an overall experience aspect for that wide receiver core. Another thing that gives me a little bit of hope for optimism, though, for Alabama, that they can be a little bit better than last year, offensive line. I'm not going to beat the kid up too much, but my goodness, it'll be addition by subtraction, losing the center, McLaughlin. I'm not overreacting just a couple plays in one game. It was extremely noticeable in several games last year, the snapping issues for Alabama. And, why was Jalen Milroe not consistent on down and down out basis when you got to take your eyes off the defense and just catch the snap? Because you're off to your left, you're down on the ground. You'd be surprised what that does as far as the timing of your offense when 20% of the time you're dealing with a horrific snap. So they bring in the center from Washington, who was a freshman All-American. His name's Parker Brailsford. Should be an upgrade there, but I do worry about this though. You don't have to be Elon Musk to figure some of this out. 6'2", 275 in the SEC. I don't know if it's going to work out for 12, 13 games. So can he hold up? That's a little light in the britches, so to speak. This ain't 1975 anymore. And speaking of that Alabama offensive line, it wasn't just McLaughlin. The entire offensive line struggled last year. They gave up 49 sacks, the most in the history of Alabama football. So it was just an unacceptable effort from them. And even though they lose their top guy as far as a grade perspective, J.C. Latham, I think that they have one of the better guard combos in college football in Booker and Roberts. They'll be better. I think it was pretty big that they got Proctor to come back from Iowa. I'd like to see him lose some weight and get a little bit more mobile. But if the offensive line is better, and I'm expecting it to be, obviously DeBoer's forte is on the offense side of the ball. They're coming off their worst offensive performance in 15 years. Slight upgrade for this Alabama offense for me.
Defensively, Payne, we've grown accustomed to Nick Saban's fingerprints being all over that side of the football, but Alabama does something a little bit outside the box that's getting to be a lot more common in this NIL era. They don't just bring in a defensive coordinator. They bring in a man who was a current head coach down the road in Mobile, Alabama, in Kane Womack, to come over and take over their defense. Womack worked with DeBoer at Indiana, known for his 4-2-5 swarm defensive mentality, and we saw South Alabama flash pretty respectfully over the last couple years on that side of the ball. What I thought was interesting is that Womack met with, the former staff, him and Kalen DeBoer talking to Nick Saban about exactly what personnel they were going to be inheriting and how that system may be able to translate. When we look at Alabama, you lose a couple of key contributors to the NFL. Arguably, the costliest loss is a transfer of Caleb Downs to Ohio State, but all is not lost for this Alabama team defensively. What are your realistic expectations for how they look under first-year defensive coordinator Kane Womack?
First year could be a little questionable, but I
First
do
year in
like
Tuscaloosa, you are correct.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly going to be some level of drop-off here. I do like the ability that they've had together, right? I mean, I think we talked about this in the Big Ten preview. We referenced those 2019-2020 seasons for Indiana when DeBoer and Womack were under Tom Allen. Those were two of the most efficient defensive seasons Tom Allen's Hoosiers defense had with Kane Womack pulling the strings, and that's ultimately what propelled them to get that South Alabama job you mentioned. And if you look at that stop, I mean, Womack inherited a South Alabama defense that was outside the top 100 in efficiency and within 3 seasons peaked to the top 40. Everywhere that Kane Womack's been, he's improved the defense, but the bar is certainly higher at Alabama. It's certainly higher following a guy like Nick Saban. And I think if you're a Tide fan, you would just want things to remain status quo from a defensive standpoint, but I don't think that's going to happen year one. You mentioned some of the scheme shift, right? There's going to be new terminology. There's new positions. You mentioned that 4-2-5 swarm defense. Saban ran more of a 3-4, but it did morph into a 4-2-5, a lot of times. You look at how this defense will be built, right? It's built to stop the run. It's built to stop all of the quick pass stuff, the horizontal stuff, eliminate yards after the catch. The way linebackers in the secondary positions themselves, they keep their eyes on the ball, which allows for that ability to create turnovers. Long term, I think that's probably easier to grasp than some of the stuff Saban was trying to employ with like the pattern match. When you look at the scheme, how you want to attack Alabama this year as an opposing offense, it's vertical, right? Get the ball downfield. And then I kind of apply that to where Alabama could be vulnerable defensively based on personnel. It would make me a touch nervous, and it's why we're projecting some regression here. The secondary certainly has some talented pieces. You mentioned Caleb Downs leaving. But I think, it's an interesting mix, especially at corner. Damani Jackson transfers in from USC. He was a top 15 player in the 2022 class, dealt with a little bit of an injury. 700 snaps of college ball so far. 130 passer rating allowed when closest man in coverage, over 21 yards of reception allowed. At the other corner position, it's a battle between a 5-star true freshman, Zabian Brown, and a 3-star Wake Forest transfer, Deshaun Jones, who signed in May, so there's a lot of catch-up there. Keon Sabb, we mentioned him. We like him at free safety. Elite freshman season and 300 snaps for Michigan. Malachi Moore is the holdover from the Saban era, enters year 5-plus player. Devontae Smith is going to be playing the Husky position. 57 total snaps in 3 seasons at Alabama, so we have no idea what he is heading into year 4. Lots of the depth pieces you look at are freshmen, right? It's Mincy, Mbakwe, Red Morgan, a 3-star kid. Mike Norvell identified as that's the 3-star that should be rated higher. Saban all of a sudden offers, he goes, and supposedly Red Morgan's had a huge spring, not surprising there. Linebacker room, you have Lawson and Campbell, 2 former 5-star top 25 players in their respective class. I liked Lawson when he was moving forward last season. 46 stops, 30% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. When he dropped into coverage, struggled a little bit. You have Campbell, who made that huge sophomore season elite plus player, needs to be a little bit more consistent in year 3. If you watch some of those games, sometimes it looked like Campbell was the best player on the defense. Kentucky game was outstanding, A&M game, USF, but then he struggled a little bit against Ole Miss, Georgia, and Michigan, so you need more consistency there from Campbell. Defensive line group is what appears to me to be weak. I understand the depth and the experiences there. Who's the horse? I don't see a Dallas Turner. I don't see a Chris Braswell. I sure as shit don't see a Will Anderson Jr. So who's the pressure-getting disruptor here? And I just talked about some of the questions in Bama's secondary. What happens if Womack has to blitz to get pressure? So you have Tim Smith, you have Tim Keenan, right? You have Robinson, Latham, Otis, Payne, James Smith, Overton transfers in from A&M. They're all good players. Which one's next level? And I don't see it. And the schedule does Alabama no favors. We're projecting 5 top 25 offenses for the Tide. Aside from Mercer, there isn't a week where Bama can go through the motions or take that deep breath. So I like Kane Womack long term, but year one, Alabama's defense is taking a step back.
One last thing, guys, before we move on to their Iron Bowl rival in Auburn. And, Brad, I want to come back to you. When you look at the way Alabama's numbers have moved, of course, when Nick Saban announces his retirement, there's a mad dash to look to try and sell Alabama stock, thinking that there's going to be a transition period, and rightfully so. But we've seen the market come back a little bit and some buzz out of SEC media days that maybe this Alabama team is being overlooked given how far their stock had been sold off. What's your overall sentiment in terms of the way the market has responded to all the changes around this program?
I'm kind of with the market moves. I mean, there was, believe it or not, when the Saban news dropped, there was a few places that had win totals up at that point. And at the time, you're thinking, my goodness, the transfer portal for the next 30 days is going to be open on an Alabama roster that's still extremely talented and close for everybody else. So I thought, hey, this roster is going to be completely rated here. And it wasn't. So kudos for DeBoer for keeping most of the roster together, at least as best as he could. So original position was let's fade Alabama at every opportunity, any market that's up right now, whether it be win total, whether it be game of the year markets against like a Georgia or whatnot. And then when things started to settle down, hey, you know what? Maybe this is being a little square, but when I see a 10-1 on Alabama to win the SEC, and I think, I'm not that high on we'll get to them, but I'm not overly high on Texas. I have questions about Ole Miss, have questions about LSU. Obviously, Georgia's right there, but my goodness, if I can get a 10-1 on Alabama, I'm going to take a flyer on something like that.
Makes a ton of sense. It's all about price discovery and some of the unknowns that we see with these proud programs when there are changes in leadership. But the one thing that Alabama fans should be able to hang their hat on, Kalen DeBoer has won every stop along the way. And you have to imagine that Tuscaloosa won't be much different.
Look what he's doing in the recruiting class.
Oh,
for
it's
2025.
phenomenal.
Right? And it shocks people for some reason. It's like the dude just sent 3 first-rounders on offense to the league. Like, I didn't think offensive recruiting would be an issue here. And again, like long-term, like buy on Alabama because Kalen DeBoer is that dude, and he's done it everywhere with lesser talent. And I think Brad's point was very good there, right? If you just look at where Alabama has been priced in previous years, right? It's 10.5, 11.5. So 9.5 is certainly a new price point for Alabama, and I think that's why we've seen a little bit of buyback. But offensively should be fine. Defensively is the big question for me.
Look, we talked about it at great lengths. The one coach that'll be under the most pressure if he doesn't excel and a program dips off while Kalen DeBoer surged at Alabama would be Sharon Moore in Ann Arbor, because you wonder if DeBoer would have been a better fit there to take over that program once Harbaugh moved on to the NFL. Hugh Freeze, though, down at Auburn, when we look at the Tigers for their preseason expectations, win total sits at 7.5, shaded to the under. We've seen their long shot odds to win the SEC drift out right around 40 or 50 to 1 when that number opened. We're now looking at that 75 range, if not a little bit higher at some shops. And as far as Auburn and their current trajectory, 3 straight losing seasons as a program for the first time since 1975 to 1977. 3 straight seasons with a losing record in the SEC for the first time since they did it in 9 straight campaigns from 1944 to 1952. The only SEC team with a worse league record over the last 3 years, the Vanderbilt Commodores. 11 straight losses against ranked teams, with the last win coming against number 10 Ole Miss back on October 30th, 2021. So Auburn, nowhere to go but up, at least at this current juncture. And we knew it was going to be a slow build for Hugh Freeze, trying to figure out what he had with existing talent and where this team would need to spend in the transfer portal, what it would look like from a recruiting standpoint. So there are plenty of fresh faces there that should make this team that much more competitive. But Payne, when we look at this team offensively, Derek Nix is going to work with Peyton Thorne. I think when you saw how Thorne ran the offense last year on the Plains, a little bit surprising that they leaned so heavily into his mobility, a skill set we never saw much of when he was under center for the Michigan State Spartans. But we look at where this team was from SEC rank standpoint under Thorne's leadership. Worst in passing yards, worst in completions, second worst in touchdown passes, worst in interceptions, and the offensive line did him no justice either. Second worst in quarterback hits allowed. Peyton Thorne can't do it entirely on his own. Is there enough support, whether it's in the backfield, at the receiver position, or along the offensive line, that allows this Auburn offense to look a little bit more like what we've grown accustomed to at Hugh Freeze's previous stops?
Directly, probably not. I mean, I think for as long as Hugh Freeze debated having a new quarterback for 2024, it kind of tells you what his thought process is, but he stuck with Payton Thorne. But there was a large, if you remember that whole situation last year, it's like, yeah, we're going to explore a quarterback situation. And then all of a sudden, Payton Thorne had a good end of season. We're like, oh, he's our guy. And then he sucked in the bowl game. And like, we're going to open this back up. And it's just this very fluid situation. Ultimately, here we are with Payton Thorne again. And I don't think that's necessarily an endorsement of him. But I think, Freeze understanding that Auburn isn't set up to compete for a conference title or a playoff berth this season, basically chose to save millions of the NIL fund to use when he thinks Auburn's on the cusp of accomplishing like those larger goals, right? There were plenty of quarterbacks out there that he could have gotten a bidding war for, specifically Cam Ward, and they kind of chose not to. I think what is changing offensively this season is Hugh Freeze is calling the plays full time, right? He's taken that back. Last season was the first time he hadn't, and it was a disaster early. They had one 300-yard game against a P5 opponent through the Ole Miss game. And after that loss to Ole Miss, Freeze inserted himself into the offensive meetings, was more directive in both the scheme and play calling. And you saw Auburn late in the season use more RPO, use more tempo. That increased. So kind of like a hint of what you're probably going to see with him calling plays to start this year. I think that probably helps Payton Thorne some. We did see relative improvement from him later in the season when Freeze's fingerprints were on the offense a little bit more. It's year 6 for him. He's a guy that's not going to raise the play from everyone else, right? He's not going to perform well in negative situations. Auburn had a 25% success rate on passing downs last year. You look at Payton Thorne, he really needed the assist of a play fake element. When he didn't have that, he ranked 109th out of 165 qualifying quarterbacks. A combination of receiver play and then Thorne really not having a big-bodied receiver who could make contested catches for him like a Keon Coleman when they were together at Michigan State led to Auburn having a 9% explosive pass rate. That was bottom feeder Power 5 level. And I think the other positive for Thorne, maybe showing some improvement aside from Freeze calling plays, I think what's around him, and that was your first question, has really improved, right? Offensive line play should absolutely take a tick up. Auburn had lost 4 starters heading into last season. If you look, the staff is basically raving about Connor Lew at center, who started the final 6 games last year, didn't allow a single quarterback hit, was a plus player both in pass blocking and run blocking. Staff thinks he's an All-American. Dylan Wade kicks inside to left guard. He played 800 snaps at tackle last season. Good pass protector. Percy Lewis transfers in from Mississippi State. He was the number 1 JUCO offensive tackle in the 2022 class. Played 400 snaps last season of good ball. I think Miller's another high-end JUCO kid. Year 2 at Auburn. Played 600 snaps last season. Better pass protector than run blocker. I think if you look at him, he's a guy who just needs to find consistency. He was elite against Ole Miss, Arkansas, Vandy, Maryland, Mississippi State as a pass protector. Then he was horrific against Bama and LSU. So need more consistency out of him. Big year for Jeremiah Wright. He's an average guard. The weapons are far better than last season. If you look at separation rates, Auburn was bottom of the barrel. Receiver grades, bottom of the barrel. Ranked dead last in the SEC there. So you have a guy like Keandre Lambert-Smith, transfers in from Penn State. Personally, not as high on him as the portal rating or the NIL figure would suggest. And there were some things that were, off the field a little bit of, I'd just say dicey, but certainly an upgrade for Auburn. Almost 2 yards per route run, versatile enough to line up inside or out. Cam Coleman, top 5 true freshman in the 24 class. He is going to contribute immediately. All the talk about Jeremiah Smith being generational, Cam Coleman wants to enter that chat. In any other class, he is your number 1 wide receiver. Had a monster spring. Robert Lewis transfers in from Georgia State, 2.5 yards per route run, 7 touchdowns. At that level, he's going to slide into the slot role. You even have Perry Thomas, a top 40 true freshman. The hope is that he can get his feet wet quickly to where he might be a contributor in the middle to latter part of the season. Fairweather was an upper-tier tight end in the transfer portal last cycle. He led Auburn in receiving touchdowns. He's back now, year 2 in Freeze's system. Jarquez Hunter, stay off the internet, but, a very good back in this country, right? 4.1 yards per rush after first contact last season. Really elusive, game-breaking speed, can catch the ball in the backfield. So no excuses for Peyton Thorne in year 6 with these weapons and Freeze taking the offense back over. Schedule a little more manageable than perception. 8 home games. The non-con is laughable. The 4 road trips are difficult for sure. Georgia, Missouri, Kentucky, and Bama to end the season's tough. But, Auburn has a bye between the 3 straight road games, and it's better to not waste a home game against Georgia because they're going to beat you anywhere on earth this season. So you'd much rather have, that Jordan-Hare home field advantage for a game like Oklahoma or Texas A&M than Georgia. So I think we'll see improvement down to down from Auburn, and next year feels more like their potential moving towards all in.
Brad, when we look at this Auburn team with what they bring to the table defensively, DJ Durkin takes over for Ron Roberts as defensive coordinator. It's a stop unit that trended up last year, but will look a lot different this upcoming season. In terms of SEC ranks, this was a team that was second in red zone touchdown percentage, second in third down conversion percentage against, second in pressure percentage, third in passing yards allowed per game. But a lot of the pieces that made the biggest impact up front, especially in their front 7, won't be on the Plains for the upcoming season. So when you look at how different the personnel may be for Auburn defensively, hard to suggest anything but a potential, at least small step back, even with a change of coaching, or am I selling stock at the bottom of the market, at least on paper, for what we think Auburn can be as a stop unit?
Nah, I'm more in that slight downgrade for Auburn's defense this year. Just, simple fact that don't have much returning. We're talking only 4 returning starters, well below average as far as the production. Obviously, they weren't an overwhelming group a year ago. Very average in yards per play, 47th in total defense. Scoring defense wasn't that great. I'll say this. Don't know these guys personally, but from everything I hear, not necessarily high character coaching staff, DJ Durkin and Charles Kelly, but it should be an upgrade, at least on the field.
Hey, as long as they're in charge of the burners and it's no longer on Hugh Freeze's accounts, they should be in good shape down there, Brad.
Yeah, my goodness, what a staff he's assembling here. Fits the SEC.
Big church guy.
Yeah.
Big in the church, a big religious fellow with those core principles.
Yeah, I think they'll be better, at least schematically, than what they were a year ago. But I got to question personnel. Outside of the top 2 tacklers being back, the 2 linebackers, Asante and McLeod, I think are 2 fine players. You're not going to win an SEC with those guys as your starters, but I think you can obviously be competitive against a lot of the big boys and win enough where you can improve the win-loss record this year. But, man, the guys that they lost last year weren't necessarily elite guys, but they did lose 5 NFL draft picks from this defense a year ago. I thought the biggest loss was up front. Marcus Harris was a kid that, again, not a high draft pick, but, man, super productive for multiple seasons on this Auburn defense. If you watched anything for them the last, 3 years, led the team in sacks and TFLs even last year. So who can step up with so many losses? Well, I hate to bring this guy's name up, but I think that the most likely guy up front that can be a standout is Falk at defensive end, a guy that was probably going to go to Florida State, but ended up at Auburn, 6'6", 272, stood out last year, got some snaps as a true freshman. Obviously, the workload's going to be much more this year, but he certainly stood out to me in the spring game. What also stood out is they did a good job in recruiting because they had 3 true freshmen up front on the defensive line that stood out. Will they be, instant impact guys that can make a difference this year? Probably not, but you can start to see, next year being that year where Auburn does make the leap there. Now, you got to read the tea leaves. As much as I like some of these young guys on the defensive line, they're probably thinking, hey, we can't rely on these guys 400 or 500 snaps this year. We got to increase our depth a little bit there. They went out and got multiple transfers up front. Now, when you're doing that post-spring, the quality of player, if you're not getting the top 2 or 3 guys, isn't near as what it is if you're getting guys out of the portal in December, and that's already at a position that's pretty tough to get guys anyway in the portal on the defensive line. But we'll see what the Rakes kid and Bleedy from Indiana and USC respectfully what they can do up front. The back end loses some guys too. Jalen Simpson was probably their biggest loss in the secondary. He had 4 picks. DJ James had 10 PBUs. He was their highest graded defender. Both of those guys are gone. The two cornerbacks, Scott and Lee, have experience. Freeze really talked up SEC Media Days, the Texas transfer, Thompson at safety. They went out and got another linebacker. I talked about Gote last week on the Big Ten preview for Maryland. Hell, he hit the portal and went to Auburn here in the last week. So that kind of tells you that they don't have it all together as far as this year. But I'll echo the sentiments for Payne. The schedule at least early sets up where they can build some confidence. The first four offenses they face, I mean, the nation control matters to say the least. But then Oklahoma, Georgia, Missouri, Kentucky, 3 of the 4 on the road. We'll see if Auburn can hold up, because the biggest problem I had with Auburn last year, man, from a game in and game out basis, they looked like entirely different teams. I mean, New Mexico State, that was a game that, it's shocking scoreboard, but what was even more shocking was you turn on the game and watch New Mexico State on a play-in and play-out basis push Auburn around up front on both sides. So I need to see a little bit more, and obviously they weren't interested in playing in the bowl game. So I'm kind of a lot more questions than answers. But the most confident I am is Auburn 2025, not necessarily this year.
Well, the good thing for Hugh Freeze, Brad, is that Jerry Kill is no longer on the sidelines down in Las Cruces, so they don't have to worry about scheduling a game, whether Hugh is at Liberty or, of course, down at Auburn, a team that had their number. But this will be an Auburn team that wants to take the next step forward, not going to compete with the upper echelon of the SEC, but we'll see exactly.
They play him. He plays Vanderbilt this year.
You know what? That's a good point. I forgot that Kill's on the staff there. So, all right, well, maybe that's a game where you have to back Vanderbilt on the money line.
And Pavia is the quarterback for Vanderbilt, so look out.
Diego Pavia going to get his second bite of the apple against this Auburn team that he tormented last year on the road. You guys mentioned schedule for Auburn, and I think this is a team in the SEC that it's all about schedule. That, of course, being Billy Napier's Florida Gators, who's seen their win total open at 5.5, heavily shaded to the under. Market has corrected a little bit with a 4.5 now shaded to the over. Long shots to win the SEC in the triple digits. And when we look at Florida, 3 straight losing seasons for the first time since the late 40s. 3 straight seasons with 7+ losses, the longest streak in school history. Finished the season on a 5-game losing skid after starting 5-2. 3 straight seasons with a losing record in SEC play for the first time since they did it 12 years in a row, from 1939 to 1951. But Payne, this is a schedule that does the Gators absolutely zero favors. They'll open up with Miami. Schedule includes games against A&M, Kentucky, Georgia, Texas, Ole Miss, and Florida State. Arguably the most difficult 5-week stretch to close out a season that we've seen in recent memory. When you look at the state of the program at Florida, how difficult a task will it be for Billy Napier to remain employed in Gainesville for the start of next season?
Man, this is a really interesting conversation to have, because Florida is vastly improved. I'm looking at our numbers. We have them about 6.25 points better than last season. We're actually higher on Billy Napier than the national narrative, but I know there are factions of the alumni and boosters that have chosen to stop their funding. And it's really interesting because he's telling recruits he's safe. And I think 6 wins should grant them a 4th year with this schedule, but there's clearly a lot of wait and see from kids, whether they lead for him and they're not committing yet, or even guys that are in the class that are flirting with others just to see. Because you're looking right now, as we record, Florida's outside the top 50 of that 2025 class. So there's a lot of wait and see that's going on here. I think, if you move on from Napier, he's going to find a G5 job pretty quickly. And what's interesting about this is, like, when he first got hired, they're like, oh, we want to build this long term. We want to build this so it has longevity. And so yes, he was implementing with the portal, but it wasn't nearly as much as he could have. And now all of a sudden, you were taking a little bit more of the high school approach. You're now in year 3 facing the schedule. It would seem somewhat unfair to can him, but I think 6, he keeps his job. Graham Mertz, you can just tell, far better than expectation last season, and a lot of that has to do with Billy Napier. That's the most competent he's ever looked in his career. I think the conversation this year for Graham Mertz and taking that next step is a little bit more aggression. 5.9 yards average depth of target from a clean pocket. Only 29% of throws travel 10-plus yards. I do like the offense, right? Eugene Wilson is a dude, right? And then you go and add Dyke or Dike, and then you add Badger. So you have 2 downfield threats. Badger is kind of in the weeds, a little more boom or bust to him. Word is a few better teams passed on him due to some concerns of a back issue, so that's something to monitor. Defense should improve, especially, the guys along the D-line if they're in better shape. Specifically, Cam Jackson played less than 300 snaps last year because he wasn't in shape, and that's something he's admitted, and he feels like he's in the best shape of his life. We'll see. It's just the schedule, right? Like, depending on how we weight the schedule, it's either Florida or USC with the toughest. I do think now, though, at 4.5, I would not be looking under, especially with 7 games in the swamp.
Brad, is it suffice to say that if Billy Napier can get this team to a bowl, he should be in serious consideration for Coach of the Year, given the gauntlet he's going to have to go through?
I don't know about that, but I certainly think he should keep his job if he goes 6-6. I mean, for me, it's historically tough, the schedule. And I know we live in a hot take. Everybody overreacts to stuff. But, I mean, we're talking about, at least in my power ratings, they play 8 of the top 17 teams. I haven't seen anything like that. I have it even far superior to USC schedule, which I have number 2. Average team power rating per average at 3.2 points. So that means the average team on Florida's schedule favored by more than a field goal over USC schedule. To show you, that big of a separation between 1 and 2, I mean, that's the same separation I have between the average, opponent power rating between the number 9 schedule and the number 39 schedule. So, I mean, if Florida was just playing an average SEC schedule, so still going to probably rank in the top 20 nationally, but an average SEC schedule like what South Carolina or Texas faces this year, I mean, we'd be looking at a win total of Florida with like 7. So I do think this is by far his best team that he's had. I've upgraded him significantly in the power ratings, but it comes down to schedule. And I'll give you one more. And Payne, we'll see if he fights back on this. I know he knows those schools in Florida quite well. I'm not a fan of the strength and conditioning program for Florida. And I'm worried that it might show up on a schedule like this. I see too many guys that are just quite simply too fat and too slow. And boy, when you're facing a schedule like this, I think that could show up. So if I had to bet it now, and I like Billy Napier quite a bit, I certainly would be, if you just gave me even money, I would be betting that no, he will not be in Gainesville in 2025.
Tack on the idea of those 7 games in the swamp, a lot of humidity, right? So that's just adding to the fatigue factor, but you're spot on. Billy hired this staff because he comes from the Saban tree. It's like, we need 100 polos on the sidelines. And it's actually backfired on him because he hasn't had the respect as a Nick Saban. So there's a lot of infighting. There's guys in the corporate world, so to speak, trying to position jump, and they're not all moving in unison. They're not all in lockstep there. But specifically, the strength and conditioning program has been utter dog shit. You think about some of those interior defensive linemen. I mean, how many years in a row can guys be out of shape there? So that's a good call there, Brad, especially when you think about, not just the severity of the schedule, the difficulty of it, but a lot of these games being played in humidity.
Not a great recipe for success, gentlemen, when Florida continues to trend one direction and arguably one of their most bitter rivals within the conference continues to trend in a very different one. That, of course, would be the Georgia Bulldogs, who will be playing with a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, fresh off of a season where they had national championship aspirations, didn't even make the college football playoff after they lost to Alabama in the SEC title game. When we look at Georgia, their win total, 10.5, shaded to the over. Price, regardless of your preferred sportsbook, less than 2-1 to win the SEC. Do always shop around as well. And when we look at what Kirby Smart is building in Athens, they have the best record in the FBS over the last 3 seasons, 42-2. It's the best record in any 3-year span since the 1993-95 Nebraska Cornhuskers went 36-1. Last 2 losses for this Georgia team have come versus Alabama in the 2021 and 2023 SEC championship games. The 42 wins is 5 more than Georgia has ever had in a 3-year span. When we look at what Georgia has done in league play, 24-0 in conference play over the last 3 seasons, excluding those SEC championship game losses. Currently enter the 24 season on a 39-game regular season winning streak. And Payne, It's rare when we talk about Georgia and elite quarterback play, but when you look at the odds to win the Heisman Trophy, Carson Beck, the favorite coming into the season, as he'll command Mike Bobo's offense, threw for nearly 4,000 yards and put up 24 touchdown passes last year to just 6 picks. When we look at what Georgia did, they replenished the running back room. There are a lot of receivers to like, and in terms of an offensive line, all but one of the starters returned to this particular group. So when you're looking at grading out Georgia's offense heading into the season, I'm expecting an uptick this year with Carson Beck at the helm for yet another campaign, but want to get your sentiments on where you think Georgia will rank on the offensive side.
I think you outlined it perfectly. There aren't really any holes or areas of concerns with Georgia's offense. All the position groups look really consistent. If someone were to nitpick, you could say, which of the consistent parts make a leap to being elite and can carry the offense or the team in the biggest games, because, elite teams can play their B- game or C+ game and still win. Georgia's offense specifically couldn't against Alabama last season, and they're happy that that's a non-issue this year with the 12-team format. Until there's obviously 2 teams remaining in there, but I think Georgia has to love this current format, because they're always going to be in the dance if they're this good. I'm intrigued to see if Carson Beck gets to a new level. We know how consistent he is. If you look at every aspect of his game in an Excel sheet, fantastic, right? Just an extremely fast processor. Over 80% of Beck's throws came in under 2.2 seconds. Adjusted accuracy last season was just surgical, 83%. The floor was extremely high, and maybe that's all you need, for a Kirby Smart team when you think about his defenses. But I think if you had questions about Carson Beck, they'd be pretty straightforward. Is he maybe too conservative? Right, 114th out of 165 qualifiers in depth of target. Doesn't really push the ball downfield, and that was magnified in some of the biggest games. And if you look, it leads to a big-time throw rate that was also outside the top 100 quarterbacks. And you just think about him and his positioning, right, at 6'5", he's like this big-footed, long strider in the pocket. Might be a good thing if you're one half of the Cavender twins, but bad.
I was waiting for that particular reference. Good on you for sneaking that in. Questionable off-field judgment, but that's a different discussion for a different day.
I don't know if it's not good for a quarterback when you initially knock him off his spot, and that was the one thing. He'd struggle a little bit resetting the feet quickly, and the passing efficiency would dip dramatically if you got him off his spot. This season, right, Beck is living life without pick 13 and 34. So that'll be interesting, right? Bowers and McConkey are gone. Easily Georgia's best 2 pass catchers from a season ago. You get Colby Young, who transfers in, high 4-star kid. He can be that physical X-receiver on the outside. Dylan Bell came on really strong late last season, really out of nowhere. So if he picks up where he left off, that's huge. You have Dominic Lovett, year 2, seems poised to make a leap. Ra Thomas is a solid depth piece. Hopefully, Humphreys can find his way. I'm hearing that has not been an easy transition from Vandy to Georgia for the number 3 ranked portal receiver. I get the vibe that Monken's going to use a little more 11 personnel this season with Bowers gone, but the talent in the tight end room's still there. You got Oscar Delp. Really got his feet wet late last season with Bauer's ankle injury. He was the number 1 tight end in the 2022 class. He flashed at times. And then Ben Urisic, solid veteran piece, transfers in from Stanford. So that at least allows Georgia to be multiple with their 12th usage if they want to continue to do that. But again, word I'm kind of hearing is we could see a little more 3 wide receiver set action this year. Trevor Etienne, massive portal get from your rival. Florida, 4.1 yards per rush after first contact. 19% of Etienne's runs went for 10-plus yards. Very elusive. Big threat out of the backfield in terms of, what he is relative to Kendall Milton last year. You have Roderick Robinson. He is going to be a beast. Huge spring, just a bowling ball. Offensive line will look a little bit different. You mentioned that, Todd. You lose Amarius Mims. You lose Van Pran at center. In more than 650 pass block snaps combined, that duo didn't allow a single hit on the quarterback. the staff does love what it has, obviously, with Tate Retledge. He's an absolute monster. 1.2% pressure rate allowed on over 400 pass block snaps last season. Was good run blocker as well. Fairchild, fantastic last season. 1.6% pressure rate allowed on over 550 snaps. You have Jared Wilson taking over the center position. 4th year in the system. Not much data to go on, but was a plus player in limited snaps last year. So I think the interior of the line's set. You have Xavier Trust at tackle. I would call him a college professional, right? 6th playing season, average player. Ernest Green's going to start at the other tackle position. He's been on campus for 2 years, only played 1. Feels like a big year 3 for him coming. Struggled a little bit out of the gate last season. Was horrific in games against Florida and Tennessee, but was an elite pass blocker against Auburn, Kentucky, Vandy, Missouri, Ole Miss, and Tech and Bama. And then there's some depth with Monroe Freeling and Micah Morris. We know that Kirby likes to, get his depth pieces along that O-line in the game. Schedule is interesting, right? Big name cachet. Our projection calls for Georgia's offense to play 5 top 25 defenses this season. Within that, though, it's possible it won't be as tough, right? Clemson, we talked about them in the ACC preview, transitioning a little bit on that side of the ball, and Georgia gets them in game 1 of that transition. So Clemson probably won't be as good game 1 as they will be, game 10. Our projection on Alabama, probably not as high as we think about them defensively. We talked about Texas has some holes, which we'll get to a little bit later in the show. But bottom line, no team's happier to have a 12-team playoff this season than Georgia, because you're going to have to beat them multiple times.
A couple of opportunities if they should stub their toe that still have the avenue to try and get back to the playoff, to your point, and win another national championship. And when we look at the defensive side of the ball, Brad, for this Georgia team, I mean, they've been top 5 in the FBS in scoring defense each of the last 3 seasons. I mean, this is a group that returns 5 of their top 7 sack getters a season ago. A lot of experience in the front 7, maybe not so much on the back end, but in terms of how you've graded out Georgia on the defensive side of the ball, given the questions that we have on offense, albeit not at the quarterback position, what do you expect from Kirby's team and their stop unit overall?
Yeah, I think some would be surprised because, with 7 returning starters on a team like Georgia that's not typically accustomed to having that many, you'd think, way up. I'm kind of flat on them because I thought, particularly at some positions in need, that they lost some of their better ball players. But always, you go before you look forward, you always look back. And let's be frank, last year's Georgia defense was clearly a step down from what they were in 21 and 22. I mean, didn't even rank in the top 10 in yards per play. Number 9 in total defense. Yeah, a lot of people would love that, but keep in mind they were number 1 in that category the previous couple of years. And where it really showed up is, Georgia for not just in 21 and 22, but the previous 4 years prior to last year, was the best rush defense in the country, allowing on average right around 75 yards per game, 2.6 yards per carry. Last year, 114 rushing yards per game allowed, nearly 4 yards per carry. You were lucky for several of those years to get 100 yards against Georgia rushing. Well, hell, Auburn and Georgia Tech top 200 against them. So if you're wondering why Georgia took a little bit step back in the power rating, and they certainly did. I know the record still showed that they were good, but I would have favored 21 and 22 Georgia by about 6 points over last year's team. A lot of it had to do with up front. And, Stackhouse and Brinson are back up front. Kudos. You got 2 returning experienced defensive linemen. That's usually not been the case with Georgia the last 4 or 5 years. But if you're looking for a kid like Jalen Carter or Jordan Davis, don't see it yet on that Georgia defense. What is good for them is Schumann's back as a defensive coordinator for yet another year. To hold on to your guy at a place like Georgia is saying something. Muschamp, I'll be anxious to see how much he is involved or not involved because, at least on quotes, he's transitioned to an off-field analyst role. I think some of it had to do with the fact that, you're limited to how many coaches you can have, and they really desperately, from recruiting purposes, wanted the Robinson, a guy from Alabama, Travaris Robinson, who's now the co-DC, an exceptional recruiter. So I thought that was, a pretty smart play by Kirby, at least positioning his coaching staff. I look on the outside because obviously Georgia traditionally plays, 3 defensive linemen. They mix and match. a guy like Michael Williams, a guy that was playing more with the hand in the dirt in the ground. Now he's going to transition to more of a stand-up outside linebacker. I think it fits his, personally, I think it fits him well. He certainly looked comfortable in the spring game. I think we could be looking at one of the best pass rushers in all of college football. Linebacker's fine. Mondone is back. C.J. Allen certainly flashed as a true freshman. Again, I don't know if they have that alpha dog that they had for several years there, where starting in 2017. They'll have them on the roster. The problem is they're freshmen and sophomores. So I think we're a year away from this Georgia linebacking core from being certainly extremely elite when you just look from high school talent recruiting ratings alone. I just don't know if they're there this year. My biggest concern, maybe probably on the whole team, is probably the back end in the secondary. You lose Tyke Smith, led the team in tackles and tackles for loss. You lose Bullard. You lose Lassiter at cornerback. Those three guys, all obviously got drafted. All three guys, you look at the grades, were their three highest graded overall players on defense. To lose them all at one position group is pretty concerning. I know Malachi Starks is back. He's a first-team All-American type of player. But I thought it was pretty I'll say this. Nick Saban's down at SEC Media Days. He's already much better than most of the media already because he's asking the right questions. And he was on a set with Kirby, and he asked Kirby, young guys, I know you need guys to step up. And Kirby mentioned the guy that they need to step up would be KJ Bolden, a 5-star true freshman at safety. Not to rub salt in the wound on Payne a little bit, but a kid that was probably going to go to Florida State.
Defense looks a little different with Bolden and Falk this year.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I mean, it certainly does. So look for him to maybe step in there. Not saying that he's going to be an all-SEC player right away, but they need 300 quality snaps probably from him, and they probably need Ellis Robinson, another true freshman, a 5-star kid, to play some quality snaps. So they're good. I mean, borderline great. They're just not generational like we saw from the Georgia defense in 21 and 22. I think they'll be there in 25, just not necessarily this year. And I will say this though. Schedule, I'm a little bit more concerned, and maybe some of the reasons why I'm flat, when I say flat, I'm looking at a projection. I'm a little bit more concerned with facing Alabama's offense, Texas's offense, Ole Miss's offense. All three of those teams, their stronger side of the ball is on offense compared to defense, and all three of those games being on the road concerns me a little bit. All three I'd put in the top 15 as far as a caliber offense. Clemson could be a little bit better offensively. Tennessee, I think we'll talk about them. If you're buying in Nico a little bit, they should be better offensively. Auburn, Payne just talked about them. They're going to be much better from a personnel aspect. Not that I'm projecting any of those teams to beat Georgia, and I got Georgia favored in every game, but this compared to what Georgia's faced schedule-wise the last couple of years, this is a much more difficult schedule for them.
Kirby's comments to your point, Brad, about talking to Nick Saban as a member of the media described him like talking to Darth Vader. Wasn't sure if he should play his cards tight to the vest or how transparent he should be when you're used to matching wits with the guy on the other sidelines for conference supremacy year in, year out. One last thing on Georgia, Brad. I'm not sure if you have the numbers in front of you right now, so if not, I apologize. From where they ended last year from a power rating standpoint versus where they'll start this season, you mentioned them schedule-wise being flat on the defensive side. You have their overall rating pretty much the same year over year?
I got them up a point. I believe I like their offense quite a bit. I'm one of those believers in Carson Beck. I love their offensive line, and I think they'll be fine at wide receiver. And Bowers being hurt last year is probably a blessing in disguise. I like Oscar Delp, so I'm much more of a believer in Georgia's offense.
It'll be an interesting team to watch, as the boys have highlighted, one with a little bit more margin for error with an expanded playoff in the 2024 season and going forward. You can follow all of our talented co-hosts, analysts, professional bettors, whatever you'd like to call them, on social media on X. That's at BradPowers7. You can follow Payne there as well, at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. But most importantly, for all things Bet the Board, not just in college football, not just the NFL, NASCAR, and a variety of other avenues we choose to go down as well. You can follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And if you haven't already done so, encourage all of you loyal listeners, guys and girls out there, to subscribe to the Bet the Board podcast newsletter, which carries an additional best bet throughout the course of the football season, delivered directly to you each and every Friday throughout the fall. From the Georgia Bulldogs and to a former SEC East rival in the Kentucky Wildcats, when we begin to look at what Coach Stoops has brewing in Lexington, their win total sits at 6.5. Did open shaded to the under. We've seen that flip a little bit, with that price tag now shaded to the over. Odds to win the conference, though, still long shot territory in the triple digits for Kentucky to emerge atop the heap. When we look at the Wildcats, this is a program that's won 7+ games for the 7th consecutive non-COVID season. They won on the road in the regular season finale last year at number 9 Louisville. It was the first road win versus an AP top 10 team since defeating Penn State back in 1977. They appeared in a bowl game for a program record 8th straight season, the 3rd longest active streak in the SEC behind Georgia and Alabama. When we look at their schedule, starts off with 4 straight at home, but they'll host South Carolina and Georgia. Anything necessarily is games you can pencil in as wins. Brad, offensively, Bush Hamden comes over from Boise State to take over as offensive coordinator for Liam Cohn. And before we get into the skill positions, whether it's the running back, the wide receiver, or what they have in the trenches, the first question I have for you is probably the most logical place to start, and that's what you believe Georgia transfer Brock Vandegrift can give this team under center that Devin Leary did or didn't, and some of the other Kentucky quarterbacks in the past.
Probably a little bit more mobility. I haven't seen it. Obviously, Vandegrift behind some decent quarterbacks there at Georgia the last several years. But you got to be a believer in the kid. At least the high school star rating coming out's higher than what Kentucky's accustomed to at the quarterback position. And I'll say this. Devin Leary, I got a question if he was fully healthy last year. Completed only 56% of his passes, 12 interceptions. Keep in mind, a couple of more high-profile programs in Kentucky kind of passed on Devin Leary, who had that serious injury to close out his career at NC State. So I think there's opportunity here to not take that big of a step back at quarterback. But Hamden, going to run more tempo this year. That they've talked about it. Obviously, Kentucky last year was one of the more slow tempo teams. Speaking of Hamden, just like clockwork, another year and another new offensive coordinator at Kentucky. Feels like every single year they're replacing a coordinator, and yet they still continue to put out similar results: 7, 8, 9, 10-win seasons consistently. I like Hamden. I thought he did a nice job at Boise State last year managing that quarterback situation. Speaking of quarterbacks, he was a Missouri quarterback coach prior to that. So that thumbs up as far as that hire. Vandegrift, certainly more questions than answers there. They also brought in a transfer and running back from Ohio State and Chip Trainum, who limited action, tough to get a lot of carries in that loaded running back room at Ohio State. But from what I saw, not only there, but at Arizona State, I think he can have some success. Is he going to be Ray Davis and put up a 1,000-yard season? Probably not. But let's also look at the entirety of Kentucky's rush offense last year. Wasn't that great, especially down the stretch. Didn't even average 100 rushing yards per game in their last 4 games. So, again, I think it's similar to the quarterback position where, on the surface it looks like a big downgrade, but it's not like they were overly that productive at that position last year. I do also want to mention, not that I'm a fan of the kid whatsoever throwing the football, but I do think they're going to lean into some more quarterback run game. I thought a pretty decent pickup post-spring was Wimsatt from Rutgers, a guy that's got a lot of experience. To be your backup quarterback, a kid that's originally from the state of Kentucky, I thought that was a pretty smart move in the transfer portal. And I thought overall, and Payne mentioned a couple guys on defense, a pretty underrated transfer portal class for this Kentucky offense. And speaking of that, they also got a pretty decent guy at wide receiver. First off, Barrion Brown and Dane Key at wide receiver coming back. Man, when these two kids are on, this could be one of the better SEC wide receiver corps that there is. They just need to be more consistent. I got to tell you, Barrion Brown, you pop in the bowl game. He looks like a first-team All-American as far as playing wide receiver in the return game. He's simply one of the best return men in college football. So they have some talent there, and then you bring in a kid from North Texas, Jamori Macklin, who was a 1,000-yard receiver last year. He doesn't have to be the top guy in this unit. He can be the number 3 guy, so that's a very dangerous number 3 option there. I like Dingle at tight end, flashes from time to time. And then I think more importantly, just hopefully from an experience factor, the offensive line should be better this year. Center Cox is back, and Marquise Cox is also back at left tackle there. 156 career starts for them. An offensive line that historically had been pretty good for Kentucky. They lost their offensive line coach to Alabama. It's crazy, and both offensive lines got worse there. That doesn't compute too much there, but the reality is this Kentucky offensive line that's been a major part of the reason why they've been so consistent, has had a down couple of years. And I just think from an experience factor and the fact that they're going to lean in more to the run game, at least out of the quarterback position, I think they'll be okay there. So I think if you just heard me talk, you're thinking I'm thinking way up on Kentucky's offense. It's tough for me to put the power rating up when you lose your quarterback, you lose your running back, you got yet another offense corner. But I don't see the big time downgrade here on this, and probably one of the reasons why I think that this team's being a little bit undervalued, at least in the early markets.
Payne, when you begin to look at Kentucky on the defensive side, Brad White as defensive coordinator put together a stop unit that finished second in the SEC against the run, but finished outside the top 100 in third down defense. The defensive line dealt with a rash of injuries throughout spring practice. They were able to turn turnovers into points, scoring 7 non-offensive touchdowns, which had them tied for the most in the FBS with Notre Dame and SMU. But the defense took a step back as the pass defense posted some bad numbers, finishing the year ranked number 86th in passing EPA per play, 123rd in passing success rate, and 127th in completion percentage allowed. Do we expect Kentucky's defense to bounce back and remind us of some of the other better stop units that Mark Stoops has built during his time in Lexington?
You would think so, right? You mentioned Stoops. You mentioned Brad White. There, to me, a lot of continuity on this defense when you think about that. And, top 20 returning production in the country. I thought last year, like you, was disappointing relative to what they had coming back. And listen, I understand Stoops' scheme, right? He's going to let the ball get completed in front of him, right? It's just kind of what he does with his zone. But being outside the top 80 in success rate allowed was troubling, to your point. Starts with the front seven, right? Deion Walker, to me, he's a cheat code, right? 345 pounds. He's got burst. He's a fantastic run stopper. Added 51 pressures and 8 sacks from the interior. That is uncommon for a guy that size. Trayvon Ripka, back for a 5th season. Set the edge well last year. He's got enough juice as a pass rusher to be a threat. You have Keyshawn Silver. He's a plus player. Oxendine, back for a 5th year, coming off his best season. Josiah Hayes returns for a 5th season, coming off his best year. 300 snap type guy. J.J. Weaver at Jack, back for a 6th season. Swiss Army knife solid, doing everything. Good against the run. 16 sacks the last 3 seasons. He's fantastic in coverage. Unfortunately, the group did lose Keaton Wade to a larger NIL offer and a more defined role, but that front is really nice when you think about a program like Kentucky. So that's a good starting point. Linebacker room, to me, has the potential to be one of the best in the country. We know what De'Aaron Jackson brings to the table, good run defender and tackler. He was fantastic last year in coverage, and then they went out and found his running mate in the portal. Jamon Dumas-Johnson transfers in from Georgia. He was the #1 portal linebacker of this class. Brad just mentioned all that young talent at linebacker for Georgia. Well, Dumas-Johnson wanted a guaranteed starting job in year 4 for the Dogs. Kirby Smart couldn't guarantee him that, so he lands, at Kentucky. Over 1,100 snaps of SEC ball. That was very damn good. He is a good player going forward. That's when he's at his best. Run defender, pressure guy. Leave the coverage stuff to Jackson and Weaver. Secondary, to your point, again, it was not a good pass defense. I don't want to sugarcoat that. But Stoops has this infamous zone scheme, so it's willing to give up all of the underneath stuff that sometimes can pad the success rates. Maxwell Hairston is a perfect fit for Stoops' system. 67 passer rating allowed last season when targeted. I think when you look at him, he's best playing off in breaking on the quarterback. 9 havoc plays created on passes, added 61 tackles from the corner position with an 8% missed tackle rate. Nice to have a willing tackler at corner. He's a beast. Dunn looks to have momentarily locked up the cornerback 2 spot. 4-star kid from the 21 class who signed with Ohio State, got his feet wet last year for Kentucky, but his role is going to expand in a major way. You just know with Hairston on one side, Dunn's going to get tested early and often. Hardaway is a nice depth piece if Dunn isn't ready for that expanded role. Zion Childress, a veteran piece at safety that Stoops likes to use, kind of like a queen on a chessboard, moving him all around. I think Childress, if he can return to the 2022 form, that'd be massive for the secondary to improve. His downside's tackling, 23% average missed tackle rate the last 3 seasons. You have Alex Afari, a nickel guy. He's had 2 very nice seasons to start the Kentucky career. Jordan Lovett penciled in at the other starting safety. he's a big question mark for me, and it seems like Mark Stoops as well, because Kentucky hit the portal for 2 safeties and landed Christian Story from Alabama and then DJ Waller from Michigan. So it seems like that safety position's very fluid as we head into fall camp here. Schedule-wise, there's really a massive delta between the offenses Kentucky will face this season. Like at one end of the spectrum, right, you have Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas, Tennessee. They're all projected top 20 offenses, and the first 3 I mentioned could be top 10, right? And then at the other end of the spectrum, it's like Southern Miss, Ohio, Vandy, Murray State. I think Kentucky is a defense that kind of smothers those latter units. And the one thing I think, like Mark Stoops has seemed to have established a very kind of consistency that allows him to like take care of the surefire wins on the schedule. But in terms of reaching the peak, I really think it comes down to Brad's offensive side of the ball with Brock Vandergriff. If Brock's floor is on par with Devin Leary, but the upside is superior, then Kentucky's going to blow through their win total. And I don't think the Wildcat defense will have as much on their plate this season. And if that happens, I think Kentucky has every chance to get back to form defensively and have one of those units that's maybe, fringe top 25-ish, that's in that, 25 to 32 range in terms of schedule-adjusted efficiency when the dust settles.
It has no doubt been a football program that you would have told me a decade ago would be, I'm not going to say on par in terms of the overall fan interest with what they're doing on the hoop side, but getting more investment. Coach Stoops spurning or testing the waters to go to Texas A&M, electing to come back with Kentucky, gives them a little bit of stability at the head coaching position, and we'll see if the Wildcats can do what they've done, and that's getting bowl eligible on a somewhat consistent basis, even in a much more difficult SEC this season. From the Wildcats to Tiger Country, down in the Bayou, where LSU sees their win total under Brian Kelly's leadership sitting at 9.5. That's a number that was right around 9.5 flat. It's taken some under money, now shaded to that under. Price to win the league, still hovering right around that 10-1 number at this point. When we look at LSU, they'll play 2 Big Ten teams in the non-conference schedule with the boys from SoCal and a neutral to kick things off against USC. Finishing kick the last 7 weeks includes somewhat manageable games versus Arkansas and Vanderbilt, but the other 5 opponents, including Florida, don't offer much in the way of an overall respite. As far as Brian Kelly, this is an LSU program that's won 10 games in each of its first 2 seasons under Brian Kelly, and he also has the longest streak of 10-plus win seasons, 7 by any active FBS head coach. Won 6-plus SEC games in consecutive seasons for the first time as a program since 2010 to 2012. But Payne, the offense, going to look a heck of a lot different without a Heisman Trophy winner in Jaden Daniels. They led the FBS last year in points per game at 45.5, yards per play 8.4, and total yards per game more than 540. But they were 9-0 when they allowed fewer than 40 points, but when they gave up more than 40, even that high-powered offense just didn't have the answers. Garrett Nussmeier takes over at quarterback. The receiving room looks a little bit different, and the depth at running back doesn't appear to be the same stable of capable backs that they had a season ago.
I'm actually, after listening to Brad, going to steal something from his playbook regarding Georgia and using that as a reference point. When you go from number one, historic type unit, and you regress to, let's just say LSU becomes still a top 10 offense this year, that gap is massive. And probably even more so when you're talking about offense, which equates to winning far more than defense. And that's really what this becomes about this season for LSU, right? When you're number one by a wide margin in EPA per play, and now suddenly you have to replace a Heisman winning quarterback drafted number 2 overall with 2 of the top 23 picks at wide receiver. The goal here is, let's hope the dip isn't enormous. I think that is really what LSU's hoping for. And if all goes perfectly, then maybe LSU has a crack at another top 10 offense this year. You mentioned Garrett Nussmeier. I think he's comfortable in the environment, right? He's been at LSU since 2021, bided his time. He's taken a good number of reps in key games against Georgia and Wisconsin, and there's clear ability and strengths here. Very fast release, extremely willing to stress a defense by being aggressive downfield. Some might say too aggressive. He's got a career ADOT that approaches 12 yards. Big-time throw rate of nearly 8% over his 3 seasons at LSU. That's 3rd best among qualifying quarterbacks. Now, Brian Kelly has openly praised Nussmeier for his growth and ability to use all parts of the field this offseason. kind of take what's given. Be willing to read the underneath stuff first before always kind of looking at that deep number one option. We'll see if that part of Nussmeier's game's improved, and clearly, he doesn't have the ability in the run game as Jaden Daniels. So even if you said to yourself, hey, Nussmeier reaches his peak and he's as efficient as Jaden Daniels as a passer, you're still losing a massive part of the offense in terms of the run game. The offensive line could be the best in the country, so that's a positive for Nussmeier, right? Returning 4 starters, 2 of which could be first-round picks in the 25 draft. Will Campbell has the ability to be the first tackle taken next April. Elite run blocker, very good pass protector, was thrown in the fire as a true freshman. Emory Jones is running mate at the other tackle spot. You have Garrett Dillinger, who we talked about ahead of last season, who was making that transition to guard. It paid off. Best season in 3 years for him at LSU. He returns for year 4. Miles Frazier in year 5, the former FIU transfer, played extremely well last season, especially in pass protection. Just 6 pressures allowed on 474 pass block snaps. The lone new starter is DJ Chester at center. He was the number 1 interior lineman in the 23 class. So the experience dips, but the talent increases there at the anchor position. One thing I will say, though, is some of those pass protection numbers likely take a little dip back without the mobility of Jaden Daniels. The other thing that's happening up front, and it's a very intricate change, is the running scheme is changing a little bit. You have a new offensive coordinator in Joe Sloan. He's implementing a zone rushing gap scheme. So what he's hoping for is to take all those talented linemen, put more on their plate, and have them moving a bit more this season. Running backs is interesting. I would think more on their plate. Jaden Daniels led the team with 120 rushing attempts last season. Garrett Nussmeier is not a threat, so I think you see a more traditional runs with Josh Williams and Caleb Jackson out of the backfield. Both are plus running backs. The pass-catching group is interesting in that, it loses Neighbors and Thomas. So the elite go-to guys are gone. Ton of depth. Does a horse emerge? Brian Kelly is adamant it's Kyron Lacey. He says Lacey's taken on the leadership role within the position group, and he's gained a ton of personal confidence that's going to allow him to be the alpha on the field. We'll see. He looked great in the spring game, but Brad's going to tell you about that LSU secondary in a moment. I mean, Kyron Lacey was running naked out there. There just was not much in the way of defense in that spring game. So it'll be interesting to see. Tight end Mason Taylor is going to be more involved this season. You have Anderson, the former top 50 kid. He's back, has speed, brings some special teams value as well. Chris Hilton has blazing speed. CJ Daniels transfers in from Liberty. He was elite at that level, nearly 4 yards per route run. Will that carry over? Probably not, but he's still good enough, right? He's versatile enough. You can line him up outside or inside. You have Xavier Thomas transfers in from Mississippi State. He was their number 2 receiver. So there's 6 reliable weapons for Garrett Nussmeier to throw to. Can 1 or 2 emerge to be go-to guys? The schedule for LSU's offense, allows them a nice ability to transition a little bit here and gain some confidence early. You have USC, Nicholls, South Carolina, UCLA, South Alabama the first 5 games. USC's defense is going to be improved, but I don't know if it's ready to compete in the trenches against LSU's offensive line. UCLA's defense will be down. South Alabama loses Kane Womack, who we mentioned a little bit earlier. So LSU needs to take advantage early and figure out things before Ole Miss, A&M, and Alabama games in the middle of the season. But I would expect, just because you lose, 3 of the top 23 picks, that there is going to be some dip here for LSU's offense.
Well, you mentioned LSU's offense looking like it didn't miss a beat in the spring against this LSU defense that was much maligned there. I'd like to say that was a blip, but when you dig into the numbers for what they put forth defensively last year, it may be more of the same when you consider that this was a Tiger stop unit that allowed more than 400-plus yards per game and 28 points per contest, allowed more than 30 points in 8 separate games, and consistently plagued by poor tackling. So what does Coach Kelly do? He brings in Blake Baker from Missouri to take over for Matt House to try and solidify some of the things that slowed down LSU last season. Now, Brad, when you look at this Tigers team, so much was made about them being able to address some of their deficiencies in the portal. This team was going to go out there and buy the answers to the problems that they had on the roster in the spring. Spoiler alert, LSU wasn't able to do so, and I'm not quite sure this defense is going to look markedly better in 24 than it did in 23.
So I do think it'll be better. I mean, how could it get any worse? I mean, we're talking about one of the worst defenses in the history of LSU football. I mean, besides the disaster that was the 2020 COVID season. I mean, they did not rank in the top 100 in basic total defense. 6.1 yards per play allowed, not in the top 100. Just unacceptable for a program like this. I mean, hell, you pop in the tape, and you got a Wisconsin offense putting 500 yards on them in the bowl game. Obviously, Wisconsin leaves a lot to be desired on the offense side of the ball. Blake Baker. I like Blake Baker. I thought he did a wonderful job at Missouri. I think he's maybe one of the more underrated X's and O's minds on the defense side of the ball in college football. I also like some of the position hires, especially Bo Davis from Texas on the defensive line. Love that. Love it long term. Why am I mentioning long term? Because as much as I think the coaching staff upgrade, I don't see it personnel-wise from this defense. I just don't, and that may be surprising some people considering they returned 3 of their top 4 tacklers, including Greg Penn, Major Burns there at the linebacker and star positions. Top guy is back from a talent aspect in Harold Perkins. But again, when we mentioned this, we were the first ones to mention this, and people were surprised because we talked about this in the LSU Florida State preview. We were concerned that Harold Perkins was playing out of position last year. This is a see-ball, go-get-ball type of player. It could be one of the best pass rushing guys. Not that you need him off the edge on every single play, but he has a capability of being one of the best in college football, and you got him playing inside, undersized, and we'll get to it. Not necessarily like he's being protected from a really good defensive front either. So a little surprised they're going to continue to play Harold Perkins at inside linebacker. I will say this, very much reminds me, because I follow Brian Kelly very closely, did the same stuff with Jalen Smith at Notre Dame. Jalen Smith was a 5-star, one of the best players in the country coming out of high school as a true freshman, like Harold Perkins, flashed completely. You're thinking, hey, this is going to be one of the best linebackers we've ever seen in Notre Dame. Perkins, if you watched his freshman year at LSU, you'd be thinking the same thing. And then they put him and play him out of position the next couple of years. Just mind-boggling, frustrating, to say the least. Well, what's going to be frustrating for Harold Perkins personally is the fact that he doesn't even on a bad defense last year, at least he had Mekhi Wingo and Mason Smith up front to protect him a little bit. And I can tell you this, LSU was fully expecting at least one, if not both, Mekhi Wingo and Mason Smith to come back, because they played in the bowl game, and you thought they'd come back. Hey, we're getting Bo Davis, and you can come improve your draft stock. They said, nope, we're out of here. And 3 defensive linemen from last year's unit ended up in the NFL draft. So you think LSU, they got portal money. They'll get this problem fixed. They didn't. And obviously Brian Kelly made some waves with some comments about not trying to, overbid for players and whatnot. If I'm LSU, I would overbid for a couple of the guys on the defensive line this year, because I think the defensive line room is completely unacceptable. They ended up bringing in a kid from Grand Valley State. I mean, you're talking Grand Valley State to the SEC. I mean, that's a big jump, to say the least. Not like LSU hired Brian Kelly out of Grand Valley State now, did they? It's just too big of a jump to expect much from him. They got a kid from Wisconsin, wasn't the best defensive lineman, and not even close on Wisconsin's defense a year ago. The Swinson kid at edge was productive in limited snaps, but more is going to be on his plate this year. He'll probably receive more double teams. Savion Jones is an experienced player, but he's not going to wow you. Linebacker I'm fine with, even though Perkins is out of position. But as much as concern that I have with the defensive line, I have just as much concern with the secondary. Look no further than the fact that they really like this true freshman, P.J. Woodland, and he impressed in the spring game. But we're talking about a true freshman, not a 5-star kid, and this isn't K.J. Bolden or Ellis Robinson in Georgia. We're talking about a 3-star kid that's 5'11", 160 pounds, and right now would probably be a starter at cornerback for LSU. I just don't know how you can go in the season, year 3 now for Kelly, and that's what you're putting out there. It's unacceptable. And the defense is a little bit better than last year, but that upgrade on defense is less than the downgrade on LSU's offense. So overall, LSU's power rating down from last year. A team that's still with Jane Daniels still lost 3 regular season games and is playing a tougher schedule. And considering that, you look at this defense. USC's offense they got to face, Ole Miss's offense, A&M, Alabama, Oklahoma. Yikes.
Yeah, I was going to say, Brad, you took me exactly right where I was going to go with a follow-up question in terms of being a net overall power ranking differential here, net negative. When you downgrade the offense, defense gets a little bit better, but hard to be worse than what we saw from the Bayou Bengals stop unit a season ago. So LSU, a team that no doubt prides themselves on conference championships and getting into the college football playoff, when you look at their personnel from top to bottom, will have a difficult road in front of them for the 2024 season. From one Tigers to another, and when we look at this Missouri Tigers group, kind of came out of nowhere last year and surprised a lot of folks in college football with the tremendous season that they had, capped off with a bowl victory in dominant fashion against Ohio State to the tune of a 14-3 win. When we look at Missouri, their win total, 9.5, heavily shaded to the under. Their conference odds have lengthened a little bit from being in the mid-teens into the mid-20s at this point, and last year, just to kind of put things in perspective, guys, was the first season with more than 8 wins since they won 11 as a program back in 2014. First season above 500 since 2018, where they went 8-5, finished number 9 in the college football playoff rankings, their best ranking in CFP playoff history. Previous best was 16 back in 2014. Finished 8th in the AP poll, the best since finishing number 5 in 2013, and the first bowl win since the 2014 Citrus Bowl. When we look at Missouri and what they have on the docket this year, schedule sets up for them to build a little bit of momentum right out of the gates. Murray State, Buffalo, Boston College, and Vandy before their bye week. That's where things will start to get a little bit tougher. But Brad, if Missouri is going to have some success, Kirby Moore can hang his hat on a returning quarterback in Brady Cook that could be better than ever when you look at some of the weapons he's surrounded by. You do, of course, lose Cody Schrader in the backfield, but they address that need with 2 talented G5 backs, both coming from the Sun Belt. The receiving room looks to have plenty of pieces to get excited about, headlined by Luther Burden. And in terms of the offensive line, yes, there's going to be a little bit of change up there, but still plenty of continuity to believe that this offense can pick up where they left off a season ago.
Yeah, I think they can even be better than last year offensively. And, I mean, they were good offense last year, top 30 in yards per play, total offense, scoring offense. But I think when you look on paper, the personnel that's coming back and some continuity at offense coordinator with Kirby Moore, they have the potential to be top 20 across the board in those categories this year. Normally when I'm talking about a team that had a losing record the previous 8 years combined, out of nowhere wins 11 games, I'm looking for a regression. I got to tell you, I'm not seeing regression at least on the offense side of the ball. Now, Payne will paint a different story as far as the defense, but there's a lot to like here. Let's start at quarterback. Brady Cook, I don't have a poster of him on my wall like other people on this podcast, but very successful season, to say the least. 66%, took care of the football, only 6 interceptions. I think he's much more mobile than people give him credit for. You take out the sacks, he ran for over 500 yards and 8 touchdowns. Back, he's got to stay healthy. I don't know if Brady Cook's running around as much as last year because, my goodness, when you got to go in the portal and your answer is Drew Pine as your backup, not a good situation. So I will say I don't expect Brady Cook to be running around as much. I wouldn't if I was the play caller. You lose Cody Schrader. Normally I would say, that's not good. We're talking about one of the most productive running backs in the country. I'm not overly concerned because I love what they did in the portal. Nate Noel from App State and Marcus Carroll from Georgia State, 2 of the more productive G5 running backs in the entire country, not only last year, but the last couple of years. We're talking about 2 guys that combined for over 5,000 career rushing yards so far. And I get it. It's a big jump. Sun Belt to SEC. Cody Schrader, though, was a D2 player. And I'm not asking either Noel or Carroll to be a guy that has to be a bell cow like Schrader was. Split up the reps. So and 2 different type of backs. Noel's more of the home run hitter. Carroll's 20, 25 pounds heavier. Can handle more of the inside run game. So I like what they have at running back, to say the least. And then I haven't even touched on the strength of the team. Maybe is their wide receiver position. Obviously, the highlight being Luther Burden, first-team All-American type player, came out of high school as a 5-star, and last year finally showed that lived up to that 5-star billing, to say the least. And I think Theo Weiss and Mookie Cooper are really solid number 2 and number 3 wide receivers, both back. I like Marquise Johnson, averaged 29.5 yards per catch last year. Flashed it in limited action and also flashed it in the spring game that I watched. Norfleet at tight end's very solid. You mentioned the offensive line. They lose one of their better players, and Foster went in the 4th round. But I think the big reason why Missouri's made this jump, And I think Missouri might have more staying power than your typical team that you see that one season bump and then they just go back to what they were. Is Missouri is spending money, folks. They have a good, solid NIL program. And where did I see it? I saw it in how they address the offensive line. They go out and get Marcus Bryant from SMU, who's a first-team All-AAC player. He likely starts at left tackle. And where I really saw it was Caden Green was a starter as a true freshman at Oklahoma last year, and he leaves and goes to Missouri. Missouri paying more money than Oklahoma. So that to me, if I'm a Missouri fan, really excites me. And we're seeing it. You know, Payne mentioned a 5-star kid on defense. They're doing a good job in recruiting for the 25 class. I don't think Missouri's going, and not that I expect them to win 10, 11 games every year, but if you're expecting them to going back to being a 500 program, I don't see it. And there is a couple other guys I want to mention on the offensive line. The Tollison kid at center was the first play. I like looking whenever a team has a spring game draft. I like seeing who was the first overall pick. He was. Cameron Johnson's another good player up front for them. Drinkwitz loves the Membo kid at right tackle. He thinks he's the best right tackle in the country. So positive for that offensive line, to say the least. And what I also really like about this Missouri team and why I haven't been rushing to the window like everybody else to bet under 9.5, have you seen the schedule? It's by far the easiest in all the SEC. First 4 games, they don't play a single average defense. You got UMass, and they're not even included in the first 4 games. In the middle of SEC play, they're playing them. They're playing Mississippi State. They're playing Arkansas, who might have an interim coach by the time they play them at the end of the year. I mean, they play literally 4 legit defenses out of 12 games, and that's it. So I think this Missouri offense might actually put up better numbers this year.
Brad, do you think Missouri considers sending a taxi squad on the road to Amherst Week 7 after they go to College Station to play Texas A&M, deciding, you know what, we're going to keep all of our starters at home and focus on bigger, shinier objects that lie in waiting in the rest of the SEC conference schedule?
We joke about that, but it's something to really keep track of. I would expect it's a great game to start your backup quarterback and your backups, especially in this era where you can lose. You're not going to lose that game, obviously, but I think that we laugh at that, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised that they have a lot of guys sit that game out.
It's a Missouri team, to your point, that I think a lot of people are willing to write off given the blip that was last year's performance, but you wonder if they'll be able to continue their ascent and stay in that second tier. Not going to have the same resources of the Alabamas and Texases of the world in the new look SEC, but no reason to believe that if they're spending and doing things the right way, that this group can have some staying power with a very talented head coach in Eli Drinkwitz. Now, Payne on the other side of the ball, defensively, Corey Batoon comes over from South Alabama, as we talked about Blake Baker taking his talents to LSU to handle their defensive side of things. It was a group that allowed 14 or fewer points in 4 of 6 games down the stretch, but there are going to be some new faces on this side of the ball that could pose some problems and or create growing pains for a Missouri stop unit that for stretches last year was as good as a high-powered offense without some of that same star power.
Yeah, there's a lot of new from Missouri's defense. You mentioned new defensive coordinator. Corey Batoon was Kane Womack's defensive coordinator for 3 seasons, so you like that pedigree. But replacing Blake Baker's is tough, and it might not look that way with how LSU's defense will perform this season. But Blake Baker's a guy that we'd mentioned anytime we got the chance, devised really good game plans that were specific to opponent. We saw that back-to-back years against Georgia. The game plan this past season against Tennessee was ridiculously good. But the goal in hiring Batoon was continuity, because he runs a very similar 4-2-5 scheme as Baker, with the glaring difference being Batoon uses the joker position. Past the new defensive coordinator, lots of new guys have to emerge as well. Missouri's defense lost 5 NFL draft picks in there from each level of the defense. Up front, Darius Robinson was a first-rounder, set the edge extremely well, had a 15% pressure rate on pass rush snaps. Missouri also loses more than 1,500 snaps of experienced beef up front there, and Josh Landry, Relish George, Jaden Jernigan, and Niles Gaddy. This was a defensive front that stuffed more than 22% of runs last year, created a 14% havoc rate. So Missouri's defensive line is taking a step back this season. And Brad mentioned some of the NIL positioning that Missouri now has. At the high school level, it's fantastic because the state passed a law that allows kids that are committed to Missouri to start receiving NIL funds in high school. They unfortunately lost out on a guy like Ryan Wingo to Texas, but they are very competitive. One of the guys they were trying to get was Simeon Barrow. Even when he was committed to Miami, there was, if you follow the tea leaves there was a question of commitment where Missouri was trying to pluck him, but it kind of bodes to my point here that Missouri is looking for a little bit more on the interior of the defensive line. Christian Williams is back for a 6th season, big space eater inside, plays the run well, shored up his tackling last season. The staff thinks Johnny Walker is ready to make another leap. He was a 600 snap guy last season who had 8 sacks and 33 stops, best season. The rest of the defensive line, though, is interesting, and we saw Eli Drinkowitz hit the portal hard to plug some of these holes. Zion Young transfers in from Michigan State, high 3-star kid, sets the edge well. He's 6'6", 250. Darius Smith transfers in from Georgia, top 150 player in the 2022 class, 6'5", 240. He has traits. Kirby just couldn't put it together for him. Chris McClellan, top 90 kid from the 2022 class, transfers in from Florida. Showed some improvement last season, but he hasn't been more than a part-time player the last 2 seasons for a Gators defense that was starving for production. Sterling Webb transfers in from New Mexico State, had a really nice season at that level, should be a 2-deep guy. Eddie Kelly transfers in from Georgia Tech, his 3rd team in 3 seasons. Joe Moore still hanging around. The upside guy in this room is the true freshman 5-star, top defensive lineman in the 24 class, Williams Nwaneri. Can he hit the ground running? And so, I think the defensive line takes a pretty nice step back. Coaching staff has thrown numbers at the linebacker position. Chad Bailey was the horse, although he only played in 5 games last season, so Missouri's kind of lived life without him. Hopper is gone, 3rd-round pick. Tristan Newsome and Chuck Hicks are the 2 returners. Both have experience. Both are decent players, but it looks like Newsome has more to give. 3 transfers were added to the linebacker room as well. Corey Flagg from Miami, and then in May during the 2nd transfer window, Khalil Jacobs and Jeremiah Beasley both entered that room. Jacob follows Batoon from South. He's a depth piece in a familiar system. Beasley feels more like a longer-term play, so you do have some questions at linebacker. The secondary, to me, has probably more questions than the D-line. It was a group that allowed a 26% success rate on passing downs. 3 NFL guys are gone there. There was an elite corner tandem in Abrams Drain and Enos Rickstraw. Drain only allowed 47% of targets to be caught last season. Damn good tackler. Rakestraw was taken in round 2. Would have been drafted higher if not for some injury questions. Jalen Charles was a plus defender for Missouri last 3 seasons at safety. Played more than 2,200 snaps over that stretch. So I don't know. I mean, there's some guys here still, but those are 3 tough guys to lose. Looks like Drayden Norwood and Toriano Pride are going to get the first crack out on the boundary. Drayden has been solid. I think Missouri kind of needs him to make that leap in his full-time role. Year 4 for him. Toriano Pride transfers in from Clemson. Solid player when healthy. You have Dalen Carnell returns for year 4. He plays the slot position, damn good in coverage. Seems to always find himself around the ball, but does need to improve the tackling. 20% missed tackle rate last season. Joseph Charleston, 6th-year super senior at safety. Just replacement level type guy. Marvin Burks, 3-star sophomore, didn't perform well over his 100 snaps as a freshman. So, there's some real issues, I think, for Missouri's defense, but I go back to what Brad said, and I think the real positive for this defense, schedule relative to other SEC teams. I mean, you get bottom feeder FCS program to start the season. Buffalo's offense, right, we're projecting to be one of the worst 10 in college football. Boston College might be improved, but it's not going to be a great offense by any stretch. Vandy, Mississippi State, 2 offenses projected outside the top 70. UMass, who you guys joked about a little bit earlier, that's a bottom feeder. South Carolina and Arkansas have some questions. There's really 3 tough spots. It's Alabama, it's A&M, and it's Oklahoma. The other 9 offenses that Missouri faces are very manageable. So the defense visually might not take the step back you think it is if you're a Missouri fan. I think when the dust settles and we look at schedule adjusted efficiency down to down, the defense is going to take a pretty significant step back.
Be an interesting team to watch and see what Brady Cook can do in his final year in Columbia and lead the offense potentially putting up crooked numbers if the defense can't hold up their end of the bargain. From Columbia, Missouri, though, to Norman, Oklahoma, as we get to one of the 2 teams that'll make their SEC debut in 2024. That, of course, being the Oklahoma Sooners. Their win total opened 7.5, heavily shaded to the under. It's taken a little bit of over money at some books. We're looking at pretty much 7.5 flat out there. We've also seen their odds to win the conference shorten from a price in the mid-40s now into the mid-20s. And I think it's the question that we always have, making the adjustment into a conference like the Big Ten or the SEC. Oklahoma and Texas were the gold standard in the Big 12 for all those years, but do they have the players in the trenches to go through this particular grind? They'll join the SEC after spending 28 seasons in the Big 12 since the conference began in 1996, and they won the conference 14 times, where no other Big 12 member had won the league more than 4. Best record amongst Big 12 teams from 1996 to 2023, 274-90 as a program, 5th best overall in the FBS. Last year, when you look at the Sooners, they started the season 7-0 before losing back-to-back games at unranked Kansas and Oklahoma State. They were outstanding in Norman, 6-0 at home, with nearly a 31-point-per-game differential. 4th most points per game and 3rd most yards per game in the FBS last season. Led the FBS with 5 games of 50-plus points. But Payne, things are going to look a little bit different for this team on the offensive side. Jackson Arnold got his taste of major college football in the bowl game, and I guess it would best be described as uneven. He'll have a pair of co-offensive coordinators that'll share responsibilities in Seth Luttrell and Joe John Finley. There are players to be excited about at the running back position. Replacing Drake Stoops won't come easy in the receiving room, but there is depth there. But I think the biggest question that Sooners fans have to ask with a young quarterback, how fast can they build the building blocks around him, knowing that the entire offensive line will be comprised of fresh faces?
Well, I think the first thing you said when you're introducing Oklahoma is, are they going to be able to handle the rigors of the SEC? And in year one, that schedule does them no favors, and that's why they're being priced the way they are in the market. So another team, not to bury the lead, that'll probably be better than their record indicates. Specific to the offense, a lot of new parts. Seth Luttrell was an analyst on Oklahoma's staff. He got promoted to OC. He's going to start the season calling plays from the box. Now, it didn't work out at North Texas, but one thing is certain, like, he inherited a 1-11 program that had a bottom 10 offense in the country, and by the time he left, North Texas had a fringe top 40 offense. And part of the transition, having seen his style and then what you're hearing this offseason, is that Oklahoma's scheme is going to change some, right? It's going to be slightly more pro style. It's going to be a lot more balance with running. There's going to be more vertical shots, and the tempo is going to decrease a bit. So something you probably want to take note of as you're listening here. Jackson Arnold, Gatorade National Player of the Year, highest rated quarterback recruit in Oklahoma history. Uneven is the right describing word for the bowl game performance. But Venables was happy with kind of kickstarting that future. So Dylan Gabriel moves on to Oregon, and it seems like a win-win for both quarterbacks. I think there's a lot of unknowns about Jackson Arnold since the sample size is so small, but the arm talent is obvious. He's also not immobile, right? He knows where the ball needs to go. I think he does a good job giving receivers an opportunity to win. When he locates the right team, the ball's thrown pretty confidently and accurately. I think at times, though, if you just watch him, he can be a touch robotic, and it leads to the predictability, which then leads to the turnovers. And he had 5 turnover-worthy throws in the Alamo Bowl, and that was with a month to prepare for an opposing defense. But again, right, the sample size is small.
We don't talk about the Alamo Bowl on this show, just so you remember.
That's true. The other thing that was interesting, and again, I just preface this with, like, we don't have a lot of data, but when he wasn't being assisted with a play fake element, Jackson Arnold had a little bit of the check down Charlie syndrome as a freshman. Depth of target was 5.8 yards. But I think we're all just looking forward to seeing, Arnold, because the talent is endless there. And what he looked like in a bowl game 7 months ago is probably going to be irrelevant with how he looks here, against Temple week 1. You mentioned that completely rebuilt offensive line that's going to be in front of Jackson Arnold. Not something you would like as you're kind of ushering in a new young quarterback, but it led to taking 5 in the portal. It just looks like a hodgepodge of mass here, really, on paper. You got Michael Tarquin. Boy, taking full advantage of that transfer portal, seeing every part of this fine country. Florida to USC, now Oklahoma. 6th-year super senior, penciled in as the starting left tackle. I think if he returns to his 2022 form, that's a big Tarquin's probably a little bit better than we think it could be. That'd be a positive for Oklahoma's tackle situation. Jacob Sexton is the lone returner. The staff thinks very highly of him. Started towards the end of last season after feeling healthy and confident enough returning from that ACL injury. He's going to kick inside to guard. Branson Hickman, I think, was a massive get late in the portal window, and I do think improves this offense. He came from SMU, fifth-year veteran guy, back-to-back seasons of very good ball as both a run blocker and pass protector. Fabici Wiwu transfers in from North Texas, so he's got at least familiarity with Luttrell's system. 1,600 snaps under his belt. He was a plus player at the lower level, so can he just be average? I think that's the goal for him, taking the leap up to the SEC. Jake Taylor was a top 10 offensive tackle out of Bishop Gorman in the 2022 class. That high school program, man, a lot of flops. Hopefully Taylor isn't another one of those guys.
West Coast football Payne at its finest. And Gorman doesn't exactly play the most grueling high school schedule of opponents here in the city. I think there's one other program worth the damn in Liberty High School.
That's very true. They did bring in Spencer Brown as some insurance at tackle. I think the tackle position is Oklahoma's weak link. I get the vibe. Who starts there could be pretty fluid throughout the course of the season. The weapons are plentiful. I think the question is very similar to some of these offenses, like who's the go-to guy? Deion Burks is all the rave, and he's filling that Stoops role in the slot. Certainly has more juice than Stoops, but the numbers at Purdue just didn't wow me. 1.2 yards per route run the last 2 seasons, but again, he's been all the rave during spring. Nick Anderson, I thought, made a sophomore leap. 2.4 yards per route run, needs to clean up the drop. 6 on 60 targets, not good enough there. Jaden Gibson progressed as a sophomore as well, 2.9 yards per route run. Might be a little bit better of a player than people think. I know some of the teams that were recruiting him were a little bit more prestigious than necessarily his rating. The staff is excited about Petaway, a top 50 kid from the 23 class, and then you have veteran guys in Farouk and Anthony. Tight end room on paper looks vastly improved with transfers. You got Bauer Sharp and Jake Roberts. Sharp is the guy with the serious upside. Roberts is the guy with the familiarity with the system, so it's a nice little yin and yang there. Running back room is undersized with Gavin Shawchuck and Javante Barnes, but they're explosive. And if you can get Shawchuck to start how he finished last season, then there probably isn't a question of losing Tywee to Wisconsin. But if you look at Shawchuck, got in a groove late last season, 5 straight 100-plus yard games, 20% of Shawchuck's rushing attempts over that stretch went for 10-plus yards. There is some stability there with Sam Franklin. He transfers in from Tennessee Martin, certainly a lower level, but coming off a 1,400-yard-ish type season. This schedule, in totality, is really difficult, right? When you look at this: Tennessee, Texas, at Auburn, at Ole Miss, at Missouri, at LSU, home games against Bama. It's a gauntlet. From an offensive perspective, there could be a chance here. Gain confidence early, right? You have Temple, Houston, both Matadors. Tulane's going to take a tick down. You get Tennessee at home. And while you would certainly rather play easier opponents, I think if you were using, an up-down stock arrow here, you'd place down arrows on the trio of defenses named Texas, Missouri, and Alabama relative to what they were last year. From what I saw in spring, we've talked about this. LSU still hasn't figured out its corner situation or how to properly use Harold Perkins. So, yes, the schedule is daunting, but maybe less so for Oklahoma's offense.
The good thing for Oklahoma, at least they don't play a true road game until Week 9, a schedule Payne that would make Jim Boeheim in the non-conference portion of his Syracuse schedule is extremely proud.
I don't see Colgate on this schedule anymore.
I mean, look, Maine coming in late is pretty damn close to Colgate.
That is true.
Coming into Norman. And how dare you cast disrespect on O'Donnell Foyle's name and what some of those Colgate Raider programs were able to do back in the heyday. Now, defensively, Brad, Zach Alley comes over from Jacksonville State. He led that Gamecocks program to the number 1 scoring defense in Conference USA. Clearly a big step up in class when you're talking about SEC caliber players than what he dealt with there. But overall, Oklahoma improved year over year, but they were still prone to giving up the big play. And we know Brent Venables, as a defensive-minded head coach, would like to see this stop unit get to a point, not quite this year, but in future years, to remind us of what he was able to put together year in, year out at Clemson. As far as defensive leaders, you bring back your leader in sacks in Ethan Downs, your leader in tackles in Danny Stutzman, and interceptions in Billy Bowman Jr., but there was talent on this roster last year, and there still were stretches where you were left scratching your head. When you look at Oklahoma defensively, can we expect them to step up in their first foray into big boy football?
They should, just from a returning production aspect alone. I mean, at this level of football, at least in today's day and age of the portal, you just don't see, a team like Oklahoma that ranks third in the country in returning production to keep all your guys. But, I mean, it could also be a negative. Hey, they weren't good enough to move on to the NFL draft. They weren't good enough to garner a super contract at another place. So a little concerned. And also what concerned me is, boy, I know a lot of this names on this defense, which I thought would be a positive. Boy, the stats didn't back up the personnel last year. I mean, didn't even crack the top 50 in yards per play, 79th in the country in total defense. I honestly, my memory is pretty good, but I thought they were a little bit better than that after watching, some of the games. So the stats but weren't that great, and now you're stepping up in class as far as what you're going to be facing on a week in and week out basis as far as the conference goes. You mentioned Allie coming over as a new DC, obviously a Venables protege, coached with Venables at Clemson, young kid. I think, historically speaking, in a lot of other day and ages, would you rather have the 60-year-old with 30 years of DC coordinating experience like a Ted Roof, or would you rather have the 30-year-old guy? Well, I think, up until the last couple of years, give me the 60-year-old. Experience matters. Now I think things have changed so much that I don't think they downgraded a defensive coordinator. I think fresh ideas maybe relates with the players a little bit more. Allie will be just fine in my opinion. You mentioned, the top 6 tacklers being back, led by Danny Stutzman at linebacker, highly productive player for the last couple of years, not just last year. Kip Lewis is a guy that flashes at times. He's not overly big. Speaking of that, Billy Bowman, 5'10", maybe on his best day. Extremely productive, like the way he plays, hard-nosed kid, 6 interceptions, but you like to have a little bit more length at that position, especially when the margins of error are going to be that much more tighter in the SEC compared to the Big 12. Woody Washington's back at cornerback. Gentry Williams also back. Guys that have played a lot. Not first-team All-American type players, but guys that have played a lot of snaps. I like the transfer kid at edge from Ohio and Woolard. Ethan Downs, already their top guy as far as getting after the quarterback last year, returns. But now let's start to get to some of the concerns, that being the interior of the defensive line. Terry's a nice player for them. He was a Tennessee transfer last year. A lot more question marks. They brought in a ton of guys. 5-star true freshman David Stone's probably their most heralded defensive tackle recruit since Gerald McCoy 15-plus years ago. They like this Jaden Jackson kid. He impressed in the spring game. Halton and Sears also impressed in the spring game on the defensive front. But you read the one thing I love about the transfer portal, man, it gives you can read tea leaves, and it's just not smokescreen. What did Oklahoma do post-spring? They went out and got into a bidding war and went ahead and got the kid from TCU and Williams. Good player. But, I know Payne is like the IRS. He knows all the financials. But so I would guess that Williams is one of the more overpaid players in college football this year for what he ended up getting. But it just tells me that they thought, even though a lot of these guys to me flashed and the defensive line got the better of the offensive line in the spring game, the fact that they got into a bidding war and wanted to get an extra defensive lineman for this year says a lot to me. And,
didn't they also take the other kid from Louisville who ended up flipping to Texas? So they wanted even another one, too.
Yeah. I got to tell you, that doesn't speak great about the defensive line. I think it speaks worse about the offensive line because, again, if I had to do a snake draft of who I thought was impressive in the spring game, the first 4 or 5 guys might have been, if I'm comparing the offense and defensive line, the first 4 or 5 guys I would have taken would have been on the defensive line. So there's some concerns here at the line of scrimmage, and I know that's one of the major talking points. Can Oklahoma hold up at the line of scrimmage? It's just, again, you don't have to be Einstein. Alabama and LSU offensive line are not Kansas and Oklahoma State. So I have some particular back 7. I like the experience level. Man, that front leaves a little bit to be desired. They are certainly not in year 1 in SEC play going to be up to snuff to what Venables wants this defense to be, especially when you take into consideration, a lot of names on the schedule, but a lot of teams are more offensive oriented. Texas better on offense and defense. Ole Miss better offense and defense. Missouri, we just got done breaking them down. Better. I like the offensive personnel compared to the defensive personnel this year. Same with Alabama. Same with LSU. All these are top 25 caliber offenses that I know they're facing good offenses in the Big 12, but these are top 25 offenses that are more physical. So I love the returning production, but man, can they hold up for the whole season, especially up front? Man, I don't know, and now you see why the win total is at 7.5.
It's a question that Sooner fans are going to be asking of their program in year one in the SEC, no doubt, until they see a little bit of proof in the pudding against some of these SEC teams, not just on the defensive line, but also as the offensive line that you mentioned there. A team
what did you guys
ahead,
make? Because this was shocking to me, right? And I understand markets, right? The whole Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, Washington needing a new coach, Mike Norvell getting an extension. I fully comprehend wanting continuity going into the SEC. I fully get Venables being the second son of Oklahoma. But what did he do to get that extension?
It's a good question.
They locked him up to 2029. What did he do?
It is a good question. I think they wanted to try and put it in place to show a little bit of stability for the program and to try and get some of the NIL money shored up, convince boosters that they at least knew who they thought was going to be leading the program going forward. That's one thing behind the scenes that I think people have kind of bought into some of the progress that Venables has made. For me personally, I'd love to be able to see a little bit more on the field, especially on the defensive side, with a coach whose background is in terms of building defensive capabilities and overall good stop units.
I'll say this.
I mean that.
It was 50.
No,
what? 50 million, not 100 million. So I know it seems exorbitant, but we're seeing coaches get $100 million extensions. I thought 50 million. With the new
it was just locking
with the
them
new
up
contracts,
to 2029.
Dropping the bucket there for Sooner Nation not to be committing 9 figures.
I think these are the questions we had when he was hired, right?
Yep.
In general, one, you have to be the elite defensive guy, and your defenses have to go back to being elite if you're Oklahoma, if that's who you're hiring, because if he finds the right offensive minds, he's going to constantly have to be rehiring. And here we are talking about the offense, changing offensive coordinators again. And so this is going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Obviously, Venables is an elite defensive mind. Let's hope he gets the defense headed in the right direction.
Well, when you mention elite defensive minds, the next head coach we're about to break down probably wouldn't fall into that bucket, but what he's been able to do on the offensive side is pretty damn impressive down there in Oxford, and that, of course, is Lane Kiffin, who leads his Ole Miss Rebels into battle. Their win total, 9.5, shaded over, trending towards a 9.5 flat. When you look at Ole Miss, their odds have lengthened to win the conference from right around 6-1. That price has been drifting out, still in the single digits, but in that 8-9 threshold. And this is a Rebels program seeking their first conference championship since the 1960s. Ole Miss won a program record 11 games last season, finished the campaign ranked 9th in the AP poll, their highest ranking since 1969, when they were led by the first family of Ole Miss football, that, of course, being the Mannings and Archie at that time. The 2 losses in 2023 came on the road at Georgia and Alabama, who finished inside the top 5. And when we look at Ole Miss, 29 wins over a 3-year span are the most as a program since they won 29 from 1960 to 1962. Schedule extremely manageable early, as the Rebels will be considerable favorites in each of their first 6 games. Toughest games come at home, other than a road trip to LSU. And this was a program, gentlemen, that went out there and tried to address every need and then some through the portal. Brad, offensively, though, Charlie Weiss Jr. leads a team that had 7 turnovers lost in 2023, tied for the least in the FBS along with Oregon. It allowed them to create a plus 11 turnover margin, top 5 in the country. Jackson Dart back at quarterback after silencing some of the doubters that thought he might enter the portal or do something a little bit different. Running back room looks to be a little bit thinner, losing Quinshon Judkins, but maybe it's addition by subtraction. The pass-catching group looks to provide a ton of depth in terms of the weapons they return, and one key addition in the portal. And as far as the offensive line, return a couple of starters. Lane Kiffin's got the weight of the world in terms of expectations on his shoulders this season. Can this offense carry them to a 10-win season, Brad, and potentially a berth in the newly expanded 12-team college football playoff?
Yeah, I mean, on paper, you got to like what you saw. I mean, and have coming. You like what you saw last season. You like certainly what you saw in the bowl game against a pretty good defense in Penn State. I thought Kiffin certainly got the much better hand, much better at Penn State. I know they're playing without a defense coordinator, but he was in his bag, to say the least, in that bowl game. You like what's coming back. I will say this. Kiffin's been a head coach for 14 years. Go look at the track record. He's had back-to-back winning seasons. He's never had back-to-back big winning seasons. So it'll be very interesting to see Lane Kiffin, the man, to see how he handles the expectations, not even getting into the players and how they handle it. Jackson Dart, you got to start with him. I mean, he's certainly off his most efficient season. He took care of the football. You mentioned only 7 turnovers on the offense. He only threw 5 picks. Obviously more mobile than maybe he gets credit for. 500, nearly 600 non-sacking rush yards for him. You lose Judkins, but there was rumors that there might have been locker room issues with him. Bentley returns for yet another season. Hell, I remember this kid. He was flashing to me at SMU. Feels like he's entering like year 7 or 8 at this point. You also bring in a ton of guys from the portal. Amos from Miami was a 1,000-yard rusher for the Redhawks last year. Diggs, although injured, we'll see if he can be healthy from LSU. He was LSU's top running back last year. Henry Parrish from Miami, Florida, he led the Hurricanes in rushing last year. So you lose Judkins, but somebody will step up. And if not, the running back committee by approach will be just A-okay with what they got. I really like the wide receiver room. 3 of the top 4 pass catchers return. Trey Harris has a first-team all-SEC capabilities, nearly 1,000 yards last year, more than 18 yards per catch. Watkins was a very productive wide receiver a year ago. I like Priestcorn quite a bit at tight end. That's something that Kiffin's offense hasn't always had, but added to the repertoire last year in returns. Wells from South Carolina, wide receiver. Keep in mind, was a first-team All-SEC wide receiver 2 years ago prior to being out last year. So, I mean, that's as good as it gets as far as receiving room in the SEC. Offensive line. Intriguing. I think I'm going to go a different direction on that because I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, thumbs up. Offensive line is going to be great this year. 3 starters back from last year. You added 4 starters from the portal. You have 222 career starts on the offensive line. I've been tracking career offensive line starts for 15 years. That is number 1 in that time period, the last 15 years. We've never seen a more experienced offensive line. But are any of these guys any good? I got to question it because, number 1, you look at the rushing production, really fell off for Ole Miss last year. They weren't that great up front on the offensive line. Yeah, everyone's talking about these 2 Washington transfers they're bringing in from the dreaded Joe Moore award-winning at Washington offensive line. Those were by far the 2 lowest graded offensive linemen on Washington last year. And when they had to step up in class and face Michigan, got their ass handed to them up front, in my opinion. I actually was rewatching that game. I was impressed with the Washington defensive adjustments and how they reacted to the Michigan run game, getting a little off track. But the Washington rush offense certainly wasn't there. And I'm not sure that these new Washington transfers that Ole Miss is bringing in are that great. And even the guy from North Carolina, the kid from Southern Miss, I mean, if you just stack rank, and I know Pro Football Focus leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to offensive line grades, none of these 7 guys that have been full-time starters ranked in the top 300, any of them. So I still think the offensive line, despite being historically experienced, has a question mark. And then you look at the schedule, certainly, like last year, it can be a fast start for them. And it feels like the last couple of years, Ole Miss's schedule is set up this way. LSU's defense obviously isn't great. A bye before Oklahoma, bye before Florida. Georgia's really the only bad scheduling spot and personnel-wise that would, hurt this offense. So while Ole Miss's expectations, and I'm grading them differently than what I've had past Ole Miss additions. I mean, the expectations with what they did in the portal, what they have coming back is, hey, we're not only, expected to make the playoffs this year, we think we can win a couple games in the playoffs. I'm not fully buying into that. And really neither is the market. You think 9, and you look at their schedule, and the win total is 9.5. I think, Joe Q Public's going to be like, oh, they're not losing 3 games. This is easily a 10-win team. Market hasn't moved in that direction. In fact, I've seen a little bit more under money than over money at 9.5.
They are tied for the 6th shortest odds at a prominent book out here in the desert to make the college football playoff at even money, behind only Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, Texas, and Notre Dame. Even playing field with Alabama. So it's interesting when you look at some of the unique markets that we'll have available for bettors. Do you just decide to go, hey, I'm going to take Ole Miss to make the playoff at even money instead of going over 9.5, because you can't see a scenario where at 10-2, this team would be on the outside looking in of a relevant postseason berth. But Payne, some of Ole Miss's success last year came on the defensive side. Pete Golding forced to replace a bevy of starters this year, though. But last season, they allowed 7 points or less in 4 games for the first time as a program since 2014. But there was a major disparity. When they stepped up in class, you could tell that this team didn't have the beef and the bulk in the trenches to slow down the elite offenses on their schedule. So what do? They spend like drunken sailors on shore leave in the transfer portal, and they go pilfering rosters, not across the country, right in their own backyard, bringing in SEC caliber 4- and 5-star recruits. But will that be enough to allow this defense to take the next level and allow them to compete for a conference championship?
Before I get to the defense, I do want to say one thing. It doesn't surprise me that books have Ole Miss power rated 6th. We have them 8th, and we have them upgraded from last year. So, the conversations you're going to hear, and I think Brad made an astute point there, is it's relative to the market. It's relative to everyone talking about this as a surefire playoff team that can win multiple games. It's certainly better than, past iterations. It's better than last year's team. In terms of a power rating. So I don't want to get that confused, because I know fans are don't love to hear that anything negative about their team.
Which is a good point, and you guys have done a great job of making that. And there may be some fans who are tuning into this preview podcast for the first time and haven't listened to all the G5 stuff and the great work Brad did there, or the other 3 Power 4 conferences that we did. When we talk about these teams, it's not through the lens of good or bad just as an arbitrary number. It's through the lens of good or bad based on the way the market is trying to price them. So I think it's always important, to your point, when you highlight them, we're not calling for Ole Miss to go 6-6, but the difference between winning 10 games versus winning 9 is the difference between winning a regular season win total or losing one.
Absolutely. Specific to the defense, I was a little higher on their defense last year, and there was a lot of people that were not thrilled with the hiring of Pete Golding, and we were pretty emphatic that we were on the other side of that coin. We thought it was a big upgrade, and there was this assumption that Nick Saban had cordially fired Pete and allowed him to walk on his own terms, and that wasn't the case at all. I mean, Ole Miss just offered more, and life. Pete's wife wanted to be closer to family, and he preferred the more laid-back environment that you get with a Lane Kiffin. And in year one, there was some real improvement for Ole Miss's defense overall. Now, you mentioned some of those holes, the areas that needed improvement. But in totality, Ole Miss went from a fringe top 50 defense to, in that 25 range in schedule-adjusted efficiency in year one under Golding. I think the expectation is to have another top 25 defense that doesn't necessarily have the holes, and the talent's been upgraded on paper, especially in the trenches, and that was the one area that needed improvement up front, because Ole Miss got bullied last season. They surrendered 3.2 line yards per rush, didn't stuff nearly enough runs. So what do? You go out and you spend on 5-star Walter Nolan, who transfers in from A&M. It's year 3 for him. It's a money year, and that'll be the theme along this defensive line, money year. But Walter Nolan was fantastic against the run last year, didn't miss a single tackle. Be nice if the pressure rate increases a little bit. 7.5% pressure rate on pass rush snaps indicates that Nolan's 7 sacks were a bit fortunate. The other massive addition came on the edge with Princely. Money year for him as well. Pressure rate numbers skyrocketed last season. 22% pass rush win rate, 19% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, and he set the edge really well the last 2 years. So you add those two to what returns with Jared Ivey and J.J. Pegues, and you're cooking with peanut oil up front there. Money year for Jared Ivey. Played 1,700 career snaps of very good ball. Would like to see him set the edge a little bit better at 265 pounds, but did have a career high in sacks last year. J.J. Pegues is a guy that transformed his body over the years. Looked like a tight end at one point, and now he's a 315-pound tackle. Money year for him as well. He was good against the run, solid tackler. I think you're hoping that his pressure numbers return from 2022. There's decent depth past the first 4, too, right? Chris Hardy transfers in from Jacksonville State for a 6th season. Good edge setter, gets enough pressure to be a threat. Akilo Stone, really nice third guy to have in the defensive tackle rotation. 12% of Stone's snaps last year. Either a tackle or pressure. Xavier Harris has improved each of his first 2 seasons on campus. High 4-star tackle from the 2022 class. So he'll be that 4th guy in the rotation. Suntarine Perkins, top 20 player in the 23 class, played 300 snaps at linebacker as a freshman. He's moving to edge full-time, specifically that jack position. So the most talented defensive line that this staff has had at Ole Miss. Linebacker room is interesting. It's one of my 2 question marks. Chris Paul Jr. transfers in from Arkansas. Was better in 22 than 23. Can you get him to return to his prior form? Similar situation with Kahari Coleman, experienced 5th-year guy coming off his worst college season. 2022 was much better in terms of both pressure and coverage. Ole Miss rolled the dice on Raymond Collins. He was the number 1 JUCO linebacker in the 24 class. So this group is interesting. If you get Paul and Coleman to return to the 2022 form, and Collins shows to be a ready-made linebacker that's matured a little bit after the stint of JUCO ball, suddenly, the group is better than it would appear. In the secondary, I love the safety group. John Saunders was Ole Miss's best defender last season, allowed a 69 passer rating when he was closest defender in coverage, supported the run well. He has a good running mate in safety Trey Washington, who is solid in coverage, fantastic against the run, single-digit missed tackle rate for a safety is damn good. You have Yam Banks, who looks slotted to play the star position, 5th-year guy transferring in from South Alabama, solid player. Still battling Brandon Turnage for that spot in fall camp, so at least you got some competition at the star. My second big question is at corner. You lose Walton and Prince. That is a big damn deal. 2 pros, both had fantastic 23 seasons. Trey Amos transfers in from Alabama to help fill that void a little bit. Allowed 45% of targets to be caught last season as a rotational player for the Tide. 3 straight seasons of good ball. You can kind of tell, though, right, what I'm saying is accurate. That corner is still a question because Golden goes out, adds Isaiah Hamilton in May. Showed well at Texas Southern. Good first year at Houston last year. 3rd school in 3 years. He's solid in coverage but afraid to tackle. 28% missed tackle rate the last 2 seasons. You have Cedric Beavers, the number 2 JUCO corner, who provides some depth. And then you got Chris Graves, who's been in the system. And I don't know. There's a lot of bodies at corner, but it's just a real concern for me. Schedule is interesting. First 4 weeks aren't any great offenses to speak of. Georgia, undoubtedly an elite offense. But the other offenses we're projecting to have solid seasons do come with at least some variance, right? Kentucky, South Carolina, LSU, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, all breaking in new quarterbacks. So there is this non-zero chance that one or more of those situations aren't necessarily as good as you would project on paper in the preseason. You can see why the Rebels boosters and alumni are all in this season when it comes to the schedule. But it's an interesting team. And I think, there's even questions at quarterback. I don't know if Jackson Dart is that dude to play to the elite level to get you over that hump to think about multiple wins in a playoff setting or competing for a national title. But it'll be a fun season to watch Ole Miss. And certainly Lane is a guy that when it comes to offense, we have a lot of faith in. And for me, hopefully he stays put there because if there's some disruption in Gainesville, I would rather him not be there.
Jeez. A storyline worth following. We'll see if Ole Miss can realize some of their potential or if the Florida Gators elect to go in a slightly different direction to try and find a new bench boss should Billy Napier not play out. For those guys and girls that have been tuning in for more than 2 hours of SEC content, I want to remind you who you've been listening to for the duration. You can follow Brad on social media at BradPower7. You can follow Payne there as well at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. And as always, for all things Bet the Board podcast related, be sure to follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And from Oxford to Knoxville we go, gents. And it's the Tennessee Volunteers grabbing headlines, but this is a team that's seen a lot of under money come in on their win total from where it opened earlier this spring. A win total that was 9.5 shaded to the under, now sits at 8.5 shaded to the over, and their odds to win the conference have really been on the drift from that 8-9 range upwards of 20-1 if not higher, if you shop around. When we look at what Josh Heupel has been able to do with the Vols, 20 wins in the last 2 seasons. It's the most in a 2-season span for this proud football program, going all the way back to 2003, 2004. Top 20 in the FBS last year in both yards per play on offense and defense, but they're still seeking their first SEC title since 1998. They're currently mired in the longest drought in school history. They'll have a couple of good measuring stick games early on in the season, most notably a contest on a neutral in Charlotte against NC State, where Tennessee right now looks to be a 5.5, 6-point favorite. This is a team that has to replace a bevy of starters from last year's team, including a starting quarterback and 9 of 11 starters on defense. Brad, we know Josh Heupel is all about offense, and last year Joe Milton took a step back from what we saw from Hendon Hooker. They relied a lot more on the ground game with so many questions in their receiving room, and it just didn't allow them to be as explosive. 31.8 points per game, finishing 7th in the SEC after a school record and FBS best 46.1 points per game in 2022, falling to 37th in the country. The ground game was there, but the passing offense, nothing to speak of. In steps a 5-star recruit, a player that they are extremely optimistic about and what he can mean to the position. And if what we saw was any indication of what's to come, this is a guy that went out there and tormented Iowa in the bowl game, will only get better. I will not even attempt to pronounce his last name, which I will do so incorrectly multiple times this season. We'll just refer to him as Nico, and what you think he can do at the quarterback position for Tennessee in this high-powered offense under OC Joey Halsley.
Believe it or not, it's pronounced exactly how it's spelled, Ia Maliava. Ia Maliava. Once you just look at the name and pronounce it, it's not. I've seen worse, I'll put it that way. Let's talk this offense. I think that there's reason for optimism, and I think it's deserved considering you didn't get a lot from the quarterback position last year. At least Joe Milton was not Hendon Hooker, where Ia Maliava has the ability to give you that much higher ceiling, what he can do not only throwing the ball consistently on a down and down out basis. He might not be able to throw it 80 yards like Joe Milton, but I would trust him to be able to throw a screen pass better on a consistent basis better than Joe Milton. And another thing that he brings is the rushing aspect. I know Milton was a big kid, but boy, Ia Maliava is a much more mobile kid, and we saw that in the bowl game against Iowa. This is an offense last year, still top 20, and you mentioned in yards per play and total offense. It's just they weren't number one offense in the country like they were 2 years ago, and they actually averaged about 2 touchdowns less per game as scoring average. Where's the reality of this Tennessee offense? Probably, are they as good as what they were in 22? No. Are they as bad as last year per se? No. So I think the truth's a little bit in the middle, and that's why I've upgraded the offense a little bit. Mentioned that, I guess I'm a believer in Nico. I've seen enough against Iowa. I mean, that was the second most yards put on the Iowa the defense all year, the most points, although, one of those touchdowns was a pick six for Tennessee. I just think when you want to get your feet wet, playing an Iowa defense that probably should have led to a lot more mistakes than touchdowns. Thumbs up for that performance for Nico there. They do lose 2 of their top 3 rushers, and this is probably one of my bigger concerns on offense. They had a 3-headed monster at running back, probably one of the more underrated running back rooms in the country. Yeah, you lose Jalen Wright and Jabari Small combined for nearly 1,500 rushing yards. Dylan Sampson's a fine running back. Can he handle a much bigger workload? I'm not sure, and I'm not necessarily sure about what they have behind him. So I think running back depth is the biggest question mark on offense. The other thing that might be a little bit of question is just the health status of the wide receiver room. On the surface, you would think downgrade because they lose 2 of their top 3 guys, but Squirrel White is back. Brew McCoy and Dante Thornton, provided they're healthy, they weren't last year, provided they're healthy this year, certainly I think gives you a little bit more dynamic than what you had a year ago. Brazel is an insurance policy transfer from Tulane, another big body kid. You got a lot of size at this wide receiver room, to say the least. I like this Mike Matthews kid, borderline 5-star, true freshman, stood out in the spring game. So there's some weapons here for Nico to take advantage of, particularly throwing a ball down the field, stretching the teams vertically, horizontally, like they as far as their wide splits. So this has a potential of being a pretty good offense, provided Dylan Sampson also stays healthy at running back. Let's talk offensive line. 3 starters back there. Center Cooper Mays is back. They were a much better group when Mays was in the lineup than out of the lineup last year. The Spraggins kid's one of the better offensive guards in the SEC. I thought they got a pretty good transfer from LSU. Lance Hurd is going to play left tackle for them. The kid wanted to play left tackle and wanted to be a starter at LSU. The problem is LSU's got one of the best starting combos at tackle in the country, and kudos for Brian Kelly for not promising a kid the starting job, and he left, and is going to be the starter at Tennessee. You mentioned, I think astutely, Todd, we're going to find out right away with this Tennessee. It's not like Ole Miss's schedule. They're going to get a good test offensively because NC State's got a really smart defensive coordinator and they have decent personnel. We'll get an idea then, and then we'll get confirmation week 4 at Oklahoma. I'm not wild. I don't think Oklahoma's got a bunch of All-Americans, but that's a very experienced defense, a defensive-minded coach, and a defense that plays much better at home in Norman than they do on the road. So at least we don't have to wait until October to figure out, the potential of this Tennessee offense. But I will say, on the whole, on the entirety of the team, even though I'm up a little bit on this offense, I agree with the market as far as the pessimism on the under 9.5.
Will be interesting. Tennessee doesn't play Florida till week 7. Used to be one of the fixtures on the September calendar for all of us. But to your point, Brad, and like we discussed, Tennessee will get tested not once but twice during the month of September to have a pretty good idea of exactly what this football team will be going forward. And Payne, if they're to pass some of those early season tests with flying colors, it's because the defense gels a lot faster than what you would expect for a group that's going to be looking a heck of a lot different than the way that they close the 2023 season. Forced to replace the team's top 6 tacklers, replacing all 5 starters in the secondary, which may not necessarily be a bad thing for a secondary that probably couldn't stop the 3 of us during our athletic peaks. They improved from the 90th ranked scoring defense in the country in 2021 to a tie for 36th in 22 and 23rd in 2023 over the last 3 seasons. It's the fewest points per game allowed since 2008. But there are still questions they have to answer in terms of personnel. One question they won't have to answer is along the defensive line, where they bring back an edge rusher in James Pierce Jr., projected to potentially go as high as a top 10 overall pick in the 2025 NFL Draft.
Yeah, this is an interesting group for me the more I dug in. And, credit to Tim Banks. He's done a pretty nice job with this defense. There wasn't really any drop-off in year 1 after Jeremy Pruitt left, and then there's been back-to-back years of improvement in schedule-adjusted efficiency. The Vols were actually a fringe top 20 unit last year, and going back and listening to Tim Banks' presser, it was on March 19th. He said, Tennessee should have the best defensive line in the country. I don't think that's the case, but it's probably a good place to start in this preview here. You mentioned James Pierce, obviously the horse, right? First team all-conference, projected by many to be the first edge taken in next April's draft. 21% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, and I think he's just scratching the surface, right? He's got an ability with his athleticism and his length to fill in a little bit more and set the edge and be a better tackler. I think the question for me is, with Tyler Barron gone, who's the guy on the other side, right? Every single opponent is going to focus on Pierce. Every single game plan is going to have a tight end on that side. It's going to have a running back chipping. The other edge rushers are, Dominic Bailey, Joshua Josephs, and Tyree West. Maybe I'm missing something here, but Bailey is a holdover from the 2020 class. Last 2 seasons played over 500 snaps of below replacement ball. Very much an edge setter, right? Tyree West, he's moved outside, taken on the edge setting role. He's a depth guy. I like Joshua Josephs. He actually has some juice. Played less snaps last year than the year before. But he did improve, set the edge well. Missed tackle rate improved more than 20%. Pressure rate increased to over 13% in pass rush snaps. And maybe if Heupel and Nico can build leads, you like the idea of Pierce and Josephs on the field at the same time together. But I don't know who else is there in terms of getting pressure past Pierce. And so he's going to have all the focus on him. Defensive tackle group is deep. Tim Banks thinks he's got 6 starters at the position. I look at it, and certainly there's some experience, right? Norman Lott is back 5th season, his 2nd in Tennessee, had his best season last year. It was a pleasant surprise because he wasn't nearly as good at Arizona State. Amari Thomas, back for a 5th year. He's your traditional nose tackle, right? Take on 2, run stuffer. He's done that to an above replacement level. Bryson Eason, another experienced guy, far better in 2022. Jackson Moy transfers in from Stanford. Elijah Simmons back for year 6. Devin Hobbs is the fringe 5-star kid, probably the most talented of the group, but how many snaps is he going to get? So there's lots of experience in the tackle room. And many of those guys are responsible for Tennessee's run defense, taking a massive leap last season in EPA and defensive line yards allowed and stuff rates for sure. So that's nice to get those guys back. Linebacker to me requires some projecting and belief in what you're hearing from the coaching staff. Peely is a guy the staff absolutely loves. They rave about him anytime you ask, right? The sample data isn't great, and the injury history is quite large. I guess if you like following tea leaves, there's a reason the leading tackler, Elijah Herring, transferred to Memphis this offseason. It's because Peely took his job. Arion Carter, a top 200 kid in the 23 class, dealt with an injury that limited him in spring, so there's not much history there or experience. But Tim Banks says the upside's ridiculous. Jeremiah Thielander was a solid 200-snap guy last season. Listen, if health isn't an issue, the linebacker group could play better than what it looks like on paper. If not, this is going to be a serious hole in the middle of the Vols defense. The secondary, to your point at the top, Todd, has been a point of contention the last few seasons. So the room is completely revamped. Brought in Jermod McCoy from Oregon State. I think that's a good pickup, right? He allowed 57% of targets to be caught as a freshman, and he played against quarterbacks like Shador and Fafita and Cam Ward and Penix and Bo Nix. Ricky Gibson, 4-star kid from the 23 class, got his feet wet late last season. If you look at his performance, it was a little inconsistent, which you would expect. He played well against, UConn, Vandy, and Iowa, and none of those offenses are going to be confused for being good. So let's see what that looks like as a full-time starter in year 2. Jordan Thomas at the star position heads into year 3, made a solid leap last year, good against the run, average, and coverage. Boo Carter, the freshman athlete, looks like he is going to compete right away for the snaps at the star position. So for me, I look at this, there's not really I look at this and it's like, okay, you need growth from guys that have not shown it yet. And then you look at the safety position. Jacoby Thomas, right? Transfers in from Middle Tennessee State. You listen to Tim Banks talk about him, you think he was Ronnie Lott in his prime. I look at the numbers.
Every player, Payne, needs a great hype man, all right? Let that be a life lesson for you.
He's not going to be confused for a guy that played without a pinky finger, right? I mean, he just struggles mightily in run support. 22% missed tackle rate over his 1,200 snaps at the lower level. In total, his play at MTSU last season, below replacement level. Now he's transitioning to the SEC. Andrew Turrentine, right, has played 400 snaps in 3 seasons between Ohio State and Tennessee. Looks like he has first crack at the starting free safety job. Replacement level guy to this point. There's just a lot of projecting with Tennessee's defense. You have to believe what Tim Banks is selling you. And so for me, just too many questions for there not to be regression this season. I don't think Tennessee is going to compete to be a top 20 defense. Who's the second pressure guy? Is the linebacker group any good? Can the young kids at corner not be overwhelmed? Are the safeties any good? Those are a lot of questions here. I think the positive for Tennessee, though, is the schedule, right? The Vols defense avoids Texas, Ole Miss, LSU. Those are all, 3 offenses that many are projecting to be top 10. Oklahoma, Arkansas, Kentucky, Mississippi State, Vandy, North Carolina State, all breaking in new quarterbacks. So, all of those situations probably don't go as according to plan. And then you get 3 slugs in Chattanooga, Kent State, and UTEP. So the schedule may really help Tim Banks' defense in a year where a lot of questions in the back 7.
Well, we talk about one UT program that has questions, and while that fan base may believe they're capable of getting to the college football playoff and putting together a deeper run, this UT program with a different shade of orange will judge their season based on a conference title or a national championship or bust, given that they came up just short a season ago. That, of course, would be the Texas Longhorns, whose win total sits at 10.5, shaded to the under. There are some 10s out there shaded to the over, depending on where you fall on the side of Texas and their expectations for the upcoming season. Their odds to win the SEC have drifted from right around 3-1 upwards of 3.5-1. Even some prices a little bit longer than that. First appearance in the college football playoff last year. The biggest news, though, coming out of Media Day is that the SEC has decided they won't penalize opposing fan bases for the horns down gesture, so we can get that out of the way early and often. Most wins in a season for the program since 2009 when they went 13-1 and lost in the BCS National Championship. They won their 4th Big 12 title, first since 2009. They've only won 1 national title, though, in the last 53 seasons. Don't tell that to the fan base, though. They think they've become entitled to a lot more than that. And when we look at what this team has in store, this is a group that'll enter 2024 on a 7-game road winning streak dating back to 2022. That'll get tested right out of the gates week 2 against the Michigan Wolverines, where Texas projects as a short field goal plus favorite. Steve Sarkisian, 4th season as the head coach of Texas, now 71-49. Career record as a head coach at the FBS level. He's improved the overall recruiting profile, expectations, and this was a Texas team that looked a little bit better in the trenches than most Big 12 teams do. Payne, when we begin to figure out where Texas will rank in this new look conference, I mean, it's an offense with Kyle Flood and co-offensive coordinator A.J. Milwee that have a veteran quarterback in Quinn Ewers that showed flashes of brilliance and then moments of what the hell is he doing out there under center. From a running back standpoint, they lose Jonathan Brooks, but there still are players to be excited about there. It'll be a bevy of fresh faces in the receiving room. And it looks like the offensive line, though, will be the one position of continuity. So if you're trying to figure out how good this team can be from a burnt orange perspective offensively, is it as simple and straightforward as figuring out if Quinn Ewers has another level he can take his game to?
I mean, I think that's ultimately the best place to start. And I'll just be honest, you can go back to past previews where I've discussed Quinn Ewers at length, and I've felt his abilities and performance and the underlying data suggested he wasn't meeting expectation. But I saw major improvement last season, and the improvement came while dealing with a substantial shoulder injury. And so if you look, Ewers' adjusted accuracy improved 9% year over year. Turnover-worthy play rate decreased by 2%. And then you think specific of scheme fit, and Ewers is perfect for Sark's heavy RPO system, and that's evident in the data. And if you only focus on RPO throws, Quinn Ewers was elite. And so you could start to see last year where Sark really understood Ewers' strengths. So the play action rate increased 10% year over year, and Quinn was just a menace using a play fake element. And I know some of Ewers' depth adjusted metrics won't look good because the shoulder injury caused the ADOT to drop nearly 2 yards. But I think we saw Sark and Ewers understand the injury and learn how to play with it. And so you get receivers like Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell with their speed creating such a cushion. So the focus was on the intermediate throw game. And so Ewers was top 3 in the country in throwing to the intermediate window last year. Now, there's still some issues. He lacks mobility, which leads to a higher sack rate. You'd like Ewers to be better pre-snap in terms of identifying pressure. Post-snap, you'd like him to be better when he sees the blitz. The straight drop back game needs some improvement because Sark can't always layer in the play fake element to help him out. But I say all that to say this. I think the national narrative around Quinn Ewers and in correlation, right, Arch Manning is far different than actually what's happening, right? Like legacy media is dying for the Arch Manning show to start ASAP, right? We need the views, we need the clicks, we need the impressions. And I'm fine getting egg on my face with this. But the sources that we have on the ground are not thinking that way. They love Quinn Ewers internally. Ewers could have gone pro. Sark wanted him back. That clearly insinuates some type of handshake agreement transpired. There is far too smart of a team backing Quinn Ewers to not have that handshake agreement in place. So it would take something catastrophic for Arch Manning to take Ewers' job. Just downright horrific play that we have not seen from Ewers, or an injury, right? Even if Arch Manning looks slightly better in practice than Ewers, it's not enough for Sark to take the chance, assuming it happens with live bullets, to disrupt everything in a year where the schedule really allows Texas to make some noise. You mentioned the weapons, Todd, around Ewers. Far different this season. You're replacing Xavier Worthy, Mitchell, Sanders, and Whittington. That's not going to be easy. But I think we've talked about Xavier Worthy. He's going to be fine deep for Patrick Mahomes. That's about all he was, right? He ain't going up and winning a jump ball for you, right? He's not the most precise route runner. A.D. Mitchell, right? There was some he left Georgia, and Georgia's like, boy, that was a headache. The cupboard was restocked nicely. Isaiah Bond, the number 1 transfer portal guy from Alabama, comes in, made a massive year 2 leap at Bama. He's versatile, can line up inside or out. Matthew Golden, is solid. He made a year 2 leap. Silas Bolden was a solid get in the portal, 2.5 yards per route run at Oregon State last season. Let's see if he can acclimate a little bit better in fall camp. I heard spring didn't go that great. Jonte Cook was a composite 5-star receiver in the 23 class, showed well as a freshman. You got the 5-star freshman Ryan Wingo, who had a great spring. He's going to contribute year 1. Amari Niblack, that was a breakout candidate for us during our Alabama preview last season. He made that sophomore leap. He's going to be a matchup nightmare in year 3 for Sark at tight end. Running back room has talent and depth. C.J. Baxter, number 1 running back in the class of 23. You'd like to see a lower pad level, more elusiveness, but Baxter, I thought, had a fine freshman season. Jaden Blue showed extremely well. Trey Wisner is being talked about as someone that could surprise. You add in Jarek Gibson, who is the number 3 running back in the 24 class. So I think what's interesting here is the group transitioned early, right? They lived life without Jonathan Brooks late last year after he tore his ACL in some of the highest leverage games of the season, that Blue-Baxter combination. O-line, you hit it perfectly, Todd. It's going to be fantastic. It's on the list, the top 5 list of a lot of off-season chatter. 4 of 5 starters return. Calvin Banks at left tackle, boy, elite pass blocker, made strides as a run blocker, one of the nation's best tackles. DJ Campbell, another 5-star kid in the 2022 class, showed well in an expanded role last season. Now it's time to make that year 3 leap. Jake Majors returns for a 5th year at center, nearly 2,600 snaps the last 3 seasons. Last year was his best. Very good pass blocker. Hayden Connor back for a year 4, made huge strides as a pass blocker last season. Cameron Williams at right tackle, just a massive human, 6'5", 360. Sample size extremely small with only 126 snaps, but didn't allow a single pressure in that 126. I think the key there is, like, maybe if you look at this offensive line and where it could take the next step, it's like, can you get the consistent push in the ground game? The overall numbers look good in terms of line yards created, but it kind of came in bunches. It was very streaky, right? There were some elite games in there, and then there was games where the offensive line had 0 push. It was non-existent. The situational rushing needs to be better, specifically in what we deem power snaps. But I think for the SEC, the Longhorn schedule is a relative cakewalk, right? There's no Alabama, there's no Ole Miss, LSU, Tennessee, or Missouri. Georgia, Florida, and Kentucky are all at home. Michigan is down, and Texas catches them early in their initial transition phase. There are 3 defenses Texas plays on the schedule. We're projecting outside our top 100, 7 defenses outside our top 50. Wow. Now, in kind of spewing all of this positivity, I do have questions about the defense, so I'm intrigued to hear what Brad's thoughts there are, but I don't know how odds makers get to 10.5 as the win total, and this might be a little higher level, and I know we talked about it a little bit off air, and but something I've been talking about with my guys internally is like win total values for the projected top 10 teams are going to be interesting moving forward under this new playoff format. I think we're probably going to have to manually adjust what the values of wins are for these upper echelon teams. Like, what if Texas is 10-1 heading to College Station? How important is that A&M game at that point? And I get it from a fan's perspective, right? Like Battle of Texas and bragging rights and recruiting and, yada, yada, yada. But if you've already cemented a playoff berth, which I would assume a 10-1 Texas team has with their brand and the cachet of playing in the SEC, that the A&M game might not be as important as some think. So now if Texas heads into that game with 2 losses, then it means everything. But I think there's going to be some tweaks made in terms of win values for the top teams because of the expanded playoffs, which is an interesting thing to think about, potentially a higher level than just this preview here.
Well, I think the jury's out in that regard as well, too, when you look at the potential path that some of these teams will have. I mean, knowing you have to be a conference champion to secure that bye, are you better off not playing in a conference championship game, healing up some of your wounds, hoping you can get slotted in as the 5th seed, take on that G5 champion or best entrant, whatever you want to call it, hoping for the best in that regard. So you could see a lot of moving chairs in that regard. And I think to your point, 1 year's worth of data will be interesting to see. And as we have 3 to 5 year runway on this new look college football playoff, how that changes the thought process and philosophy of some of these power programs. Now, Brad, Payne mentioned the defensive side of the ball. Pete Kwiatkowski comes back for his 4th year as defensive coordinator. He will have a coach DC and Johnny Nansen for his first year. When we look at Texas last year, led the Big 12 in most defensive metrics, held opponents under 20 points per game for the first time since 2009, allowed a shade less than 83 yards rushing per game. It was third in the FBS behind Penn State and UCLA. They completely clamped down on third down conversion rates as well, but a lot of the reason Texas was able to have so much success a season ago, they had two impact players on the defensive line, Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, that masked some of their deficiencies in the back end. Both of those big bodies in the trenches are gone, and I'm not quite sure this secondary is going to be that much better to offset what they don't have in terms of the way of defensive line difference makers.
Yeah, I think you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, two major question marks on this defense that obviously was the best defense that Texas has had, since 2009. But, I mean, still, this shouldn't be confused with what Michigan or Georgia had defensively a year ago. But they were fine, particularly up front, but certainly left a lot to be desired in other categories. Let's talk, though. For me, the biggest question mark, and probably on the entire team, losing Sweat and Murphy on that interior of the defensive line. That's a first and second round draft pick, two All-Americans, two highly productive players, strength of their entire team, gone. Alfred Collins is a nice player. I mean, turn on the spring game, he's got a pick six right out of the gate. He's got nice size, 6'5", 321. Probably has the most upside, but again, a lot more is going to be expected of him with Sweat and Murphy gone. Vernon Broughton's got nice size on that interior, but hasn't been overly productive. And this is a guy that's a senior. Got to step up, to say the least. Ethan Burke was, again, solid last season. He's not getting double-teamed off the edge when you got Murphy and Sweat down low. So I wondered if some of those tackles for loss that he had were a little bit manufactured. Sorrell's a fine player at the edge. I thought Vasic, again, impressed in the spring game. But again, read the tea leaves with the transfer portal. Let that help guide you. And they're out there getting 2-3 guys post-spring on the defensive line to help out. A couple guys from Arizona, Norton and Savia, okay players, but again, national championship caliber players, no. The Lole kid from Louisville, solid player. Obviously had a big time position in need. And got some play in the portal. I'm sure he's, in my opinion, probably overpaid with what he ended up getting at Texas. But, again, not a dominant player like a Sweat and Murphy. They did bring in a highly productive player, at least in college, Trey Moore from UTSA, that been one of the best pass rushers, at least at the G5 level the last couple of years. But, again, he's transitioning, making a major jump up. The good thing for him is, you don't need him, pass rushing on a down in and down out basis. So I think on a third down pass rush specialist, Texas did a good job there as far as getting him in the portal. You lose your leading tackler, Jalen Ford, a linebacker. I'm not overly concerned there. Anthony Hill, former 5-star last year, played like a 5-star, at least comparatively speaking, as far as being a true freshman. He was a Big 12 newcomer of the year. So I as long as he progresses in his sophomore season, he can take that next step to fill the void of Ford at linebacker. A couple of seniors, Gabenda and Barron, are multiple-year contributors. Again, not all Americans at linebacker, but guys that have a lot of experience. But here's what concerns me. You had a dominant rush defense last year. Two, big guys in the middle that dominated. You only allowed 82 rushing yards per game. And yet, even with the dominant front, you were horrific on the back end of the pass defense. And you weren't facing Pac-12 quarterbacks. You weren't facing Caleb Williams and a Michael Penix or a Bo Nix. I mean, you're giving up 300 passing yards to Baylor, Houston, Kansas State, TCU.
Blake Shapen slander on this podcast, nonetheless.
I don't even know. Was Shapen playing that game? It might have been even Sawyer Robertson.
Yeah,
Maybe it was Shapen.
I think it could have been Sawyer in that game.
Yeah, Iowa State, all these guys put up 300-plus yards on this Texas defense. I mean, that's concerning to say the least. And, man, I look at this year's team. Where's the talent? I mean, this is a team that's had, you talk about the recruiting classes, and yeah, he's put them together, but I don't see a lot of elite guys in the secondary. I mean, you don't want to read too much in a spring game, but when the first team's in there, secondary look lost. Second team's in there, secondary looks lost. Third string is in there, secondary looks lost. I mean, there's nobody you can hang your hat on. Makuba from Clemson's their big portal addition. He's okay. I mean, just to put in perspective, they're bringing a transfer from San Jose State. He might actually start for him in the secondary. Muhammad at cornerback was okay as a true freshman. Hopefully he can make that leap for their sake. To me, again, this... You would think after such a porous year the secondary, you'd be having a significant up arrow, and I'm not there yet. And now they're not going to get to, in my opinion, dominant play from that interior on the defensive line. So this is a Texas defense that was better last year, but wasn't elite, and I think will certainly not be elite. I actually got a down arrow on the Horns defense, and one of the major reasons why I'm part of the under 10.5 crowd.
It's an interesting team, one that I think really envisions themselves a legitimate national championship contender. And, look, they can finish 10-2, still have a chance to be able to do that. But a lot of questions have to be answered if Texas's stop unit is going to be able to perform at a high level and erase the lasting image we have of Michael Penix throwing for 400-plus yards in that college football semifinal with NFL caliber wide receivers. Last but certainly not least, gentlemen, we continue the Texas two-step with a traditional rival that it'll be a rivalry renewed as a pair of SEC teams, that, of course, being the Texas A&M Aggies, who see their win total having opened 8.5 shaded to the under. Numbers moved a little bit, 8.5 shaded to the over. Price to win the SEC has come down a tick from 20-1 at the peak of the market into that 12 or 14-1 range. When we begin to look at A&M, this is a program that finished unranked in the final AP poll each of the past 3 seasons, despite being ranked in the AP preseason poll all 3 years, twice inside the top 10. They've now lost 6+ games in back-to-back seasons for the first time since they did it 3 straight years from 2007 to 2009. 0-4 in one-score games, all coming against ranked opponents. 0-4 on the road, but they did hold serve at home, going 6-1 at Kyle Field. The last road win for this program came in October of 2021 at Missouri. Only Temple has a longer road losing streak right now in the FBS. Schedule-wise, you draw the toughest opponents coming to Kyle Field. It'll start week 1 with Notre Dame, but Texas, LSU, and Missouri will all be there. Most difficult road game, at least on paper, is Auburn. No other road game comes against the team predicted to get bowl eligible in 2024. But Brad, if Texas A&M is going to have great return on investment, so to speak, in Mike Elko's first season, this offense, it's going to look a little bit different with offensive coordinators Colin Klein and Holman Wiggins, has to get going, and most importantly, they have to keep their starting quarterback, Connor Wegman, healthy. He's a former 5-star prospect, showed flashes last year before he was sidelined for the season with a busted up foot. When you look at Texas A&M offensively, what areas are you the most confident in, and where do you have some of the most questions for the boys in Aggieland?
Yeah, I think on the whole, I'm a little optimistic about this Texas A&M offense. Just hopefully for the fact that they can keep a starting quarterback healthy, something that hasn't been the case the last couple of years. I mean, remarkably, Texas A&M has had 7 different starting quarterbacks the last 2 years. And when you combine that with some very outdated offensive schemes from Jimbo Fisher, you got an offense that certainly hasn't lived up to talent level each of the last couple of years. Didn't crack the top 40 in yards per play, total offense, scoring offense was a little bit better there, but certainly left a lot to be desired, especially when Wegman after he got hurt. Now, when he is healthy, certainly Wegman has showed some flashes. One thing that he's done remarkably well is taking care of the football. Only 2 interceptions when he's played the last couple of years. You mentioned Colin Klein. I like the hire. I'm actually surprised they got him away from Manhattan. Starting quarterback at Kansas State, been assistant coach, offense coordinator the last couple of years. I thought he might have been a lifer there, but to get him, a guy that's, showed some balanced offenses and actually has gotten more out of his offenses, at least comparatively speaking from the talent level, than compared to an A&M, I like that hire. When you expand it beyond the quarterback, if Wegman can stay healthy, running back should be a team strength. If Owens and Moss, Daniels, everybody's all 3 of those guys are back from a year ago. They do lose 2 of their top receivers, Aniyah Smith, Evan Stewart, 2 good wide receivers. When they had decent quarterback play, they can get them the football. I like their wide receiver core. I'm not in love with it. Thomas is a big body wide receiver, played well in the spring game. Walker's another big body, averaged nearly 17 yards per catch. Moose Muhammad's played a ton of football for him. He was playing when Elko was the defensive coordinator. They brought in a couple of guys from the transfer portal, guys that were highly productive. Troy's number 1 wide receiver, Barber. Louisiana Tech's number 2 wide receiver, and Allen. That at least you're not expecting those guys to be difference makers, but I mean they certainly can fill out your wide receiver rotation. If that's number 4 and number 5, that's a pretty good 4 and 5 group there. Watson at tight end from Fresno State, in my opinion, is good. another kid that was injured last year, Donovan Green at tight end. They had high expectations. We'll see if he can return from injury. I like the skill position. The offensive line, I still got more questions than answers. 3 starters back. I like the Zune kid at left tackle. They lost, in some circles, their top guy in Layden Robinson, but I didn't like the offensive line at all really last year. I mean, couldn't run at any point with consistency. You had 5 games where you didn't even hit 100 yards rushing. It was the worst rushing offense in College Station in 15 years. You didn't rank in the top 90 nationally in runner pass blocking. So I don't. They didn't bring enough portal guys in to where I can pound my fist on the table and say, "Yep, this is going to be one of the most improved offensive lines in the country." I just don't see it with them. Basantis, withdrawing his name from the portal was a pretty good kid that probably when it's all said and done can be a quality offensive lineman. I'm just not sure that he's there in his sophomore season. The good thing is we're going to find out right out of the gate because it may be the best defense they'll face all year, and particularly a pretty good interior defensive line at Notre Dame with Cross and Mills. They could get exposed a little bit up front. So we'll at least know what they got right out of the gate. But other than that, one thing you got to like about the A&M schedule is all these teams that their top 4 opponents all have to come to Kyle Field. And other than that, this is a team's probably going to be favored in 8 or 9 games this year.
Brad, are you going to be watching that Week 1 game against your beloved Irish in real time, or is it one that you'll record and watch back uninterrupted the following day?
Probably uninterrupted the following day, unless I get reports that Notre Dame's up 3 touchdowns, which isn't going to be the case. If you've followed Notre Dame football the last 2 decades, never is the case when they play a quality road opponent. So, yeah, that'll be a game I watch on Sunday.
All right, we'll make sure we don't send you text updates throughout the course of that kickoff at Kyle Field Week 1. We'll allow you to keep yourself in a little bit of the dark in regards to that game. And defensively, Payne, for the Aggies, Mike Elko, we know, is going to institute his systems and get this group to play at a high level. Can it happen in year 1 under defensive coordinator Jay Bateman remains to be seen. But this is a team that has 6 defensive players on its roster that were former 5-star recruits. They've held opponents under 23 points per game in each of the last 5 seasons. Top 20 total defense in the country last year, coming home at 19th. Led the SEC in sacks, run defense in terms of yards per game allowed. Ranked 112th, though, in the FBS in takeaways, an area where they're going to have to improve. And when you look at what they'll have to replace, gone is edge rusher Edgerrin Cooper. Sacks leader was also Cooper. Interceptions and Josh DeBerry, and pass breakups Tyreek Chappell and Deuce Harmon. So when you try and assess where A&M can be with a defensive-minded head coach in year 1, how do you go about trying to forecast how things will look for the defense formerly known as the Wrecking Ball?
Well, it's actually just going to be buttoned up. Right? That's what you're getting with Mike Elko. And I think we've talked about him for years, whether it was at Notre Dame, the first time he was at A&M. We were higher on Duke's defense than Market the last 2 seasons. And so I think we're buying Mike Elko, right? And he's proven to me more than just a one-trick pony, that he could actually lead an entire team and build an organization. And you just think about what he inherited at Duke. It was a team that won 5 games in 2 seasons. And then won 16 over Elko's 2 seasons there, and he dealt with a very difficult schedule last year and a quarterback injury. So I think A&M is a buy-on team. We've seen that from professionals. We've seen that a little bit in the market. And I think when you have the ability to pair oil money with X's and O's, right, it makes for one of the rare times I don't mind a defensive coach leading the way. And already defensively there's been an infusion of talent to go with all of those 5 stars that you mentioned. Everyone, and I mean everyone, wanted Nick Scorton, right? Yep. That was Florida State's favorite player in the portal. They were going all in for him. Scorton planned to take 4 visits total. It was FSU, Oklahoma, and Missouri. A&M offered later. He visited them, and Elko locked it down. No other visits happened. Now he gets to go back home, which is a bonus for Scorton. But when I look at him, you think of a guy playing defensive end at 280 pounds, he'd be an edge setter. It's like, no, 21% pass rush win rate, 16% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, just this wicked spin move that he can execute without slowing down, but he's damn good setting the edge as well. He's got top 15 potential in the 25 draft. Shamar Stewart, the number 1 player in the state of Florida back in 2022, Elko raves about him. We saw it on field last season as well. He was unplayable as a freshman, but he improved last year to replacement level, 14% pressure rate on pass rush snaps, serviceable against the run. And I think when you have a guy like Elko, he's going to get the most out of him. Walter Nolan is certainly a loss inside, but Shamar Turner returns, and he was arguably the better player at tackle last season. Held up great against the run as an undersized tackle. Then he added 36 pressures. If A&M's offense can build leads, you got that trio of Skirtin and then the two Shamars. They are going to be eating quarterbacks on passing downs. DJ Hicks, great freshman season, over 150 snaps, number 1 defensive lineman in the 23 class, going to start at tackle this season. Albert Regis, right, a fine run-stopping tackle. He's back for year 4. Solid space eater. Just lots of dudes were added from the portal as well, right? A&M goes out and steals Cassius Howell from the poor. 18% pressure rate on pass rush snaps last year at Bowling Green with 10 sacks. Brad would be able to know if that transition's going to go well, but you're asking him to be a depth piece and not a number 1. I just think there's so much talent along this defensive line, and their true talents maybe weren't being brought out of them, that I'm expecting a guy like Elko to get whatever that player's peak is out of them, right? Malik Sila, a top 65 kid from the 2022 class. He's been mentioned by Elko multiple times this offseason. Rodis Johnson transfers in from Wisconsin. Veteran guy, very nice depth piece at tackle. And that was the elite part of A&M's defense last season. 22% stuff rate, 15% havoc rate. There's very few teams in the country that can lose a Walter Nolan along their defensive line and not have sleepless nights. A&M is one of them. Linebacker position does have the most questions to me. You mentioned the guy at the top there, Todd, and Edgerrin Cooper. Now, Torian York was one of the least heralded freshmen headed to A&M last season, a middling 3-star kid. Ends up playing nearly 600 snaps of damn good ball, well above replacement level, gets named captain. That's one of the few positive stories that transpired at A&M last season. Now, do we see a sophomore slump? I don't know. Solomon DeShields transfers in from Pitt in late April. Let's see how quickly he can acclimate. Scooby Williams follows defensive coordinator Jay Bateman from Florida. A lot of talent, but Scooby has been mostly unplayable for 3 straight seasons. Maybe the change in environment helps, but depth at linebacker worries me a little bit here. On paper, A&M secondary looks improved. Will Lee comes in from Kansas State, solid coverage guy, really willing tackler. Elko gets Tyreek Chappell to remove his name from the portal in return. 3-year starter, veteran guy, only allowed 39% of targets to be caught last season. Jaden Hill follows Jay Bateman. He'll start at nickel, 5th-year guy, average player. Bryce Anderson made a big leap last year, has to improve as a tackler. Dalton Brooks, very familiar with the situation here. Played nearly 200 snaps as a top 150 freshman last season. Only allowed a 45 passer rating when targeted. Got to clean up the tackling a little bit. 36% missed tackle rate. Overarching here, like the A&M defense is really interesting. I was taken back a little bit by the Jay Bateman hire. Probably better options out there, but it's just like we have so much trust in Elko, and we know the defense is going to have his fingerprints all over it. Schedule is a little wonky, right? Lots of big-name cachet, and Notre Dame out of the gates is tough. But we sold Arkansas in the market, right? Other pro bettors sold Missouri. LSU taking a step back. Texas could take a step back if they can't stop the run. Only 4 true road games all season for A&M. So there's a real possibility if Connor Wegman plays to his ceiling that Elko is going to hit the ground humming here in year 1.
Interested to see if they can incorporate Marcel Reed some way, shape, or form as well, a dynamic playmaker at the quarterback position that they're extremely high on. We saw a little bit of him in the bowl game with a Texas A&M team that looked like a shell of itself. But the final question I have on Texas A&M, Payne, and I'll come back to you on this. Has anyone seen or heard from Jimbo Fisher since he was relieved of his post down there in College Station?
Just out there counting the Franklins. He's probably doing it by hand rather than the money machine because he's trying to kill some time.
Look, I mean, we should all be so fortunate to have that fate. Sign a deal for $75 million, take our payout, and ride off into the sunset. To see what happens there. Gentlemen,
good coach back
we
in the
did
day,
have one other team slated for the best of the rest, but given the length of this particular SEC breakdown and us covering the 12 most relevant programs in the conference, I'm going to use the presidential veto around these parts and exclude our short breakdown that we were going to include for South Carolina and move on to one of the more actionable elements of this very fine podcast and open the floor up to you my esteemed colleagues for the best bet, whether it's the SEC or elsewhere in the college football landscape.
Let me start, Brad, and then you can piggyback because you've got some good stuff there. We discussed LSU, and it's time-stamped above, so we won't be overly long-winded here. But even if Garrett Nessmeyer reaches the level of Jaden Daniels in terms of a thrower, the offense is going to regress because it doesn't have the legs. You're also replacing 2 first-round picks. We talked about the defensive side of the ball, certainly lacking in the trenches. The secondary did not look any more improved in the spring game. You also have to question where the funds are being allocated, right? These coaches typically know their teams better than us. And so, yes, we just saw a great get just yesterday, 24 hours ago, where LSU beats out Miami and Oregon for Mr. Pickett. That's in 2025. They were not willing to spend in the portal along the defensive line, and it tells me that they might not be as high in this team as others. So when I look at this, I have a very conservative downgrade of 2 points, LSU year over year. The schedule increases, but I also think within that 2-point downgrade, there's a lot more variance. There's the potential for a larger drop. Like when I look at Alabama, for instance, right, we've downgraded them like 1.25 points year over year. The floor there with DeBoer is higher than what it would be at LSU in my mind. Like this has the potential to maybe go completely off the rails if Nessmeyer isn't as good as a passer as Jaden Daniels. So the other thing is this came into range. This is really good. We're going to have to talk about this in the offseason, Brad. If you can start betting some overs for us in like March, April, May, June, and we can just come back in under at better prices in July, I think this is a good thing because this was not a play at 9. Now that we have 9.5 access to minus 145, let's go under on LSU. Brad, I know you have some interesting data there regarding your man as head coach.
Well, obviously, we mentioned when we were discussing, LSU, that Brian Kelly's got 7 straight 10-win seasons, although he only got the 10 wins each of the last 2 years at LSU due to, bowl wins, so he didn't get there in the regular season each of the last 2 years, and I'm not sure that this year's team's any better. In fact, in a lot of instances, I think they're worse, and on top of that, I think they have a tougher schedule than what they faced the first 2 years, and I'm always looking for regression. Kelly, the last 21 close games, 18-3 record dating back to Notre Dame in one-possession games. And you're thinking, oh, Kelly's just that guy. Well, I mean, his first 8 years at Notre Dame, he was 22-20. So, I mean, which is what you'd expect, 50%. So, if that regression comes when you got a schedule that I currently project 6 of their 12 games to be priced at a touchdown or less, that would be, if that regression comes this year, then we're not going to have to sweat this one.
When you talk about regression in close games, Brad, there's one fan base in this country that hopes that's music to their ears. It's not LSU. They happen to reside right in the heart of the country in Lincoln, hoping that maybe this is the year that regression works in Nebraska's favor in those close games and works against LSU. Gentlemen, this was truly a labor of love throughout the course of preparing these preseason previews. Brad, it goes without saying you carried the baton for all of the smaller conferences and did an outstanding job with an hour plus on all 5 of those leagues. If our listeners haven't already gone back and listened, you should do so. Some of the best information you'll get in 1 hour snippets. Brad covers all the conferences from top to bottom to get you ready for all things that you need for the college football season. It's been great getting to do these Power 4 conference previews with the two of you. Didn't anticipate that they'd all take 2.5 to 3 hours, but we know as we continue to improve the product around Bet the Board home base, this is what it takes to be the biggest and best college football podcast and provide the kind of information that can't be replicated through any periodical or any preview anywhere else. So it's a credit to both of you guys and the time that you put in getting prepared for each and every college football season that you're able to pass along to our listeners.
What I will say, and looked, last year's podcasts were between 2 hours and 20 minutes and 2 hours and 45 minutes. But that was with 5 previews. So the expanded conferences has led to a little bit of a longer show over 4. Brad does not know this yet, but he's not done with preview season.
Uh-oh.
I know a lot of people are wondering where the hell's Notre Dame. Brad the last few years has done the Week 0 podcast. I want Brad to just deep dive Notre Dame, spend 10, 12 minutes on each side of the ball, because the Week 0 slate is kind of meh.
You're not going to jump on and talk Florida
I was going to
State?
ask, Brad, is Payne going to conveniently dance
No.
between the raindrops
God,
and
no.
not jump on there to preview his beloved Florida
No.
State Seminoles
God, no.
and their
God,
pilgrimage to Ireland?
No, not a chance. Not a chance.
Mm.
Not going to happen.
Disappointing.
Week 0, that's all you, buddy.
All right, so you can count down to the Week 0 college football podcast, but preview season not over around the Bet the Board home office. We'll be back about 10 days from now with some NFL coverage, or 2 weeks, previewing each division in great detail. We'll give
August 1st.
We'll give Brad time off for good behavior. It'll be you and me, Payne, and our esteemed pro bettor Billy jumping into the fold potentially as well as we break down those divisions. But the season gets here soon, less than 50 days until we're talking about college football kicking off in earnest Week 0. No idea where the offseason is gone, but I feel we're buttoned up and ready to go and continue to put some winners on the book. So any parting shots for you guys before we close the book on college football preview season up until we get closer to Week 0?
No.
Silence speaks volumes, gentlemen. Silence speaks volumes. For Brad Powers and Payne Insider, I'm Todd Fuhrman. Best of luck with all of your preseason investments and building out those portfolios. But most importantly, with an LSU regular season win total ticket under the posted total in hand, we'll see you at the window.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of Bet the Board. Make sure you follow Todd and Payne on X. Todd is at Todd Fuhrman. That's TODDFUHRMAN. And Payne is at Payne Insider. That's PAYNEINSIDER. Don't forget, our weekly newsletter comes with an additional best bet. Have that delivered to your inbox by clicking the link atop the podcast show notes. And most importantly, subscribe and download Bet the Board. We're on Apple, Spotify, Amazon Wondery, YouTube, Google Podcasts, and all your other major platforms.